Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Moore began quietly testing them both. He'd let Clara draft contracts, guiding her hand to keep terms firm yet fair. He'd let Ezekiel oversee repayments, teaching him the art of patience, knowing when to press, when to wait, when to trust. The two of them, so different in manner, found themselves circling the same truth, that the ledger was more than ink. It was dusty, hollow backbone. Meanwhile, the world beyond the valley stirred. The railroad, which had once passed close without swallowing them, now sent agents again. This time, they were more cunning. They offered not just to buy land, but to partner. They spoke of depots, warehouses, of turning Dusty Hollow into a hub where goods from east and west would flow. To us in town, it sounded at the moment to leap from survival to prosperity. To others, it smelled of change wrapped in silk. The town taught another meaning, and Haran, older now, let Clara stand at the front beside him. She held the ledger in her hands, her voice calm but clear. "This book ain't just debts and credits," she said. "It's proof that we've endured because we've chosen steady over sudden. If we hand ourselves over to men who write terms in cities far from our storms, we'll lose more than coin. We'll lose the creed that kept us alive." Some balked, they grumbled, but Ezekiel stood too, rough hands resting on the back of a chair. "We've all seen fast deals. They shine bright and burn out quick. Dusty Hollow ain't about burning, it's about enduring. If they want to trade with us, they trade by our terms, not theirs." The room rumbled with agreement, not because the words were loud, but because they rang true. The railroad men left unsatisfied, their promises of easy riches falling flat against the weight of a community bound by trust. That night, their rain pattered on the schoolhouse roof. Harard sat by the fire with Clara and Ezekiel. His voice was soft but steady as always. "The ledger yours now, in spirit if not in hand. It don't matter whose name is on the page. What matters is that every line means patience, every debt means trust, every payment means endurance. You carry that forward and Dusty Hollow will outlast storms I'll never see." The years that followed proved him right. Clara became the natural keeper of the ledger, her careful script filling the pages. Ezekiel enforced its creed with the respect of the ranchers and farmers. Together they balanced fairness with firmness, making sure the jars stayed full, not with greed, but with proof that Dusty Hollow remained unbroken. And when Harard Graves finally laid down his pen for good, the town mourned not with despair, but with gratitude. They buried him on the hill overlooking the hollow, his marker plain and steady. Just like the man, he kept the ledger, he kept the town. But the story didn't end there. The Dusty Hollow had learned, through Harard and the book he built, that fortune was not chance, not strife, not gamble. Fortune was patience. Fortune was fairness. Fortune was trust, written line by line, year by year, storm by storm. Clara Bell took to the ledger like a river takes to its banks. Her handwriting filled pages with a balance of grace and firmness, every loop of ink neat in a stitched seam, every number tallied square. Where Harrod's script had carried the weight of storms endured, Clara carried the promise of storms yet to come. Folks respected her not because she stood in Harrod's shadow, but because she had earned her own. She listened when men fretted over debts, but she never wavered on fairness. And in time, even the most stubborn ranchers stopped doubted that the ledger could rest steady in a woman's hands. Ezekiel K., for his part, became the arm that kept the ledger honest. His word carried weight among ranchers, for they knew he'd walked the same fields, sweated under the same sun, lost calves to the same winters. When Clara spoke from the ledger, Ezekiel was the one who made sure its creed reached the barns, the fields, the fences. Where Harrod had been one man standing steady against storms, Clara and Ezekiel became two pillars, different in style, but bound by the same truth. Dusty Hollow, under their watch, grew not into a city, but into something rarer, a town that knew itself.
Didn't chase railroad, didn't beg for investors, didn't gamble away its soil for quick gain. Instead, it built slow and strong. Barns stood straighter, wells dug deeper, fences stitched wider. The second schoolhouse was raised. The first burst with children. The saloon was rebuilt. The gathering hall. Dear contracts were signed under Clara watched live. And through it, the levee grew heavier, its pages whispering the town's story line by line. But the West never leaves a place untested. Trouble came not from storms this time, nor from slick drifters like Silas Crow, but from prosperity itself. With steadiness came surplus. Harvests of gold granaries to bursting, cattle herds outgrew pastures, jars filled quicker than men's before. For the first time, Dusty Hollow faced the temptation not of scarcity but of abundance. Merchants from beyond the valley came sniffing. They offered contracts to buy grain in bulk, to ship cattle east on rail lines that had inched flowed over the years. They promised profit beyond anything the town had seen. Some townsfolk, flushed with coin, began to think perhaps they no longer needed to ledger slow hand. Why borrow or trade through Clara when merchants weighed sacks of silver outright? Why trust patience when prosperity seemed bound? Ezekiel saw the danger first.
He had known hunger, and he recognized the arrogance that came when bellies grew too full. A fat calf forgets the winter. He muttered more than once, watching men swagger with new boots and win eye dresses from distant catalogs. Elra, too, felt the strain. Debts paid faster than expected. Contracts offered higher than her fair turners. The ledger was not being abandoned outright, but it was being questioned. Its pace too slow for a town tasting quick profit. Then came the season that tested them. The merchants, having fattened their purses, began to shift terms. Prices dropped, contracts twisted, wagons delayed. Those who had sold heavy to outsiders found themselves squeezed. Their profits shrunk, their goods devalued. For the first time in years, Dusty Hollow felt the pinch not from famine, but from greed beyond its borders. Cora called the town together in the gathering hall, the ledger open on the table. She let the silence hang before speaking, her voice steady as Harrod had once been. "We forgot ourselves," she said. "We thought we could chase quick coin without paying the price. But the ledger was never about coin alone. It about trust, about balance, about building steady, not burning fast. If we trade our creed for silver sacks, we'll end Dampa Hollow with the name we bear." Some hung their heads, ashamed. Others bristled, not ready to admit their folly. But then Ezekiel stepped forward, calloused hands resting on the table. "We've seen storms before.
We've buried calves, we've rationed seed, we've faced winters colder than death. We can face this too. But only if we remember what Harlan taught us. Patience outlasts everything. If we bind ourselves again to the ledger, not to greed, Dusty Hollow will stand taller yet." The town listened. Slowly, deals with outsiders were cut back. Jars once more filled with steady trade rather than risky bargains. The lesson stung, but it carved itself deep. Dusty Hollow learned that prosperity could be dangerous tame, famine if left unchecked. The ledger, heavy now with years, became more than a book again. It became a mirror, reminding the town who it was and who it could never afford to become. As Clara aged, her students, children who had once stumbled over sums, grew into men and women who could reckon accounts with confidence. Many of them carried ledgers of their own, not in copies, but in branches of the same tree. Ezekiel, grading at the temples, taught ranchers, sons and daughters that wealth was not in the size of the herd, but in the steadiness of its growth. Together, they ensured the creed passed forward. By the time the next generation took hold, Dusty Hollow was not simply surviving, nor merely enduring. It was thriving in a way few towns in the West did.
But every man and woman that knew why this one man with storm gray eyes had once written in a crooked little office, because one woman with a sharp mind and steady hand had kept the ink flowing, because one rancher with calloused hands had carried the creed into the fields. The ledger was not theirs alone. It was Dusty Hollow's soul. By the time Clara hair silvered it and Ezekiel's shoulders bent with years of work, Dusty Hollow had grown into more than a town. It was a name carried on the lips of travelers as story passed in camps and along wagon roads. Some called it the town that patience built. Others said it was the only place in the West where a man could leave his savings without fear of being cheated. Word stretched far enough that strangers began arriving not to strike it rich, but to learn how Dusty Hollow endured when so many other towns had crumbled to dust. With fame came risk. A town known for wealth, even steady wealth, drew eyes both honest and crooked. One summer, a group of businessmen rode in from the east, dressed in tailored suits that looked out of place against Dusty Hollow weather-beaten storefronts. They introduced themselves as representatives of a trust company, a kind of banking house that promised to modernize the way the town handled its accounts. They came with polished words, books bound in leather and contracts thicker than any wagon pipe. "We admire what you've built," one of them told Clara, laying a fat document on the table. "But times are changing. Your methods are quaint, admirable even,
but inefficient. With our capital, our structure, our reach, we can take Dusty Hollow into the modern age. No more scribbling in ledgers, no more jars of coin. Who'll bring safes, vaults, interest rates. Your town will prosper beyond anything you've dreamed. Clara, old but sharp, narrowed her eyes. She leafed through the pages, each line written in a language meant to confuse more than clarify. She could see the traps, the hidden fees, the clauses that bound land and livestock to debts that could never be fully repaid. She closed the book and pushed it back. "We already have a bank," she said simply, resting her hand on the ledger, "and it lasted longer than any you've seen." The businessmen laughed, but it was not a kind laugh. They saw Dusty Hollow and stubborn, clinging to an old way in a world of progress. But Clara knew what they did not. Progress without patience was ruin dressed in silk. She sent them away, firm but polite, and the town stood with her. Not long after, another test came, this one not from slick tongues but from hard hands.
A band of outlaws, hearing tales of jars heavy with coin and a ledger that bound the whole town, decided Dusty Hollow was ripe for plundering. They rode in under moonlight, masks over their faces, guns drawn, demanding silver and gold. But Dusty Hollow was not like other towns. When the shots rang out, it was not chaos that followed. Ranchers came from their barns with rifles steady, blacksmiths raised hammers, schoolchildren, fathers and mothers stood shoulder to shoulder. The outlaws found no easy prey, no frightened crowd. They found a town that trusted itself, a town bound tighter than any chain. They fled before dawn, leaving Dusty Hollow scarred but unbroken. And when Clara entered the ledger the next morning, she did not mark loss, but unity, every debt repaid in courage, every credit balanced in loyalty. Still, not all storms came from out. Inside Dusty Hollow, a quiet struggle grew of the younger folk. Born into steadiness, began to chafe at its slowness. They had never felt the hunger of lean winters, never seen their land threatened by slick drifters or greedy merchants. To them, patience felt like a burden, tradition like a chain. They wanted faster growth, grander buildings, a town that matched the bustling cities they heard about in newspapers. One young man, Thomas Fletcher, the grandson of Jonas Fletcher, who had once argued against Harrad, became their loudest voice.
Was clever, ambitious, restless. We sit here counting calves and jars, he said in the gathering hall, while other towns are building factories, printing newspapers, sending telegraphs. We could be more than a valley with a ledger. We could be a city. The room stirred. Some nodded, hungry for change. Others frowned, wary of ambition. Clara, weary now, let Ezekiel speak. His voice carried the gravel of years, slow but unshaken. The city rises fast, he said, but it can fall faster. The valley that endures forever. Don't mistake noise for strength, Thomas. Don't mistake speed for permanence. But Thomas was not so easily swayed. He began gathering a circle of followers, pushing for factories, for contracts with outside investors, for expansion beyond the valley patient pace. It was the first time Dusty Hollow faced a storm not from famine, greed, or outsiders, but from its own children forgetting the creed that had carried them.
Clara, feeling her years heavy, wondered if Harrod's legacy might fracture. She feared the ledger would be seen not as a guide, but as a relic. Yet she also knew storms had a way of testing fences, and a fence that holds through a storm come out stronger. She placed her faith in the same thing Harrod once had, that truth, patient and steady, would outlast even the loudest of challenges. For storms never end. They change shape, and Dusty Hollow, built on patience, would have to prove again that it could weather that hunger of greed but ambition itself. Thomas Fletcher was sharp but a whip, and restless sort of helped spring. Where older folk saw Dusty Hollow's steady ways of strength, Thomas saw them as shackles. He had grown up in a town without family. Jars were always filled, bed barns stood steady. Wade the ledger was treated near sacred. To him, patience felt like idleness. His grandfather had once butted heads with Harrod graves, and Thomas carried that same fire, though without the scars to temper it. He began holding meetings of his own, gathering the youth in the saloon and painting pictures of a brighter, faster future. We're sitting on fertile land, he told them, voice eager, eyes burning. We've got cattle, grain, trade routes, even the railroad close enough to smell the smoke. And what do we do with it? Count coins in jars, write lines in a book. We could be sending cattle laced by the thousands, opening mills, printing our own papers. Dusty Hollow could be a city. Not a story whispered over campfires, but a name printed on maps in bold. Some nodded, thrilled by the sound of progress. They were tired of hearing elders preach patience when the wider world was racing forward.
Others hesitated, remembering Clara words, Ezekiel warnings, Harrod legacy. But Thomas had charm, and charm is a dangerous seed when planted in restless hearts.
Clara saw it happening, though by then her hands trembled too much to write, her voice grown thin with age. She called Thomas to her office one evening, the ledger resting on the table between them. Lantern light flickered across her silver hair as she spoke.
"Isn't this book about slowing folks down?" she said softly. "But it ain't. It's about making sure every lie adds up honest, every gain steady, every debt fair. You chase speed, Thomas, you'll lose sight of the sums. When the reckoning comes, you'll find yourself poorer than when you started."
Thomas leaned forward, fire in his eyes. "With respect, Miss Clara, the world moving on without us. You think patience will keep our children from leaving? You think slow and steady will stop factories from sprouting in the next county, taking our trade with them? Harwin ways built this town, sure, but maybe it's time we built more." Clara studied him a long while, seeing not a villain but a young man hungry for something bigger than his fences. Finally, she said,
"Then you best be sure, Thomas, that whatever you build is boom built, or else it won't stand the first storm."
Thomas left unconvinced, and soon after he began striking deals. He and his circle pooled their savings, bought machines from the east, and raised the Valley First grain mill powered by steam instead of mule and muscle. The smoke from its chimney rose high, a signal of change.
Farmers began selling to Thomas Mill instead of following the ledger's slower cycles. Money flowed fast, coins clinking louder than Clara's careful lines. Ezekiel, older now but still strong, warned him, "Fast gain fake a swollen river, boy. Looks mighty, but it'll flood and leave nothing but mud." But Thomas only grinned. "Or it'll float us farther than you had dreamed, old man." For a while, it seemed Thomas might be right. The mill churned day and night. Wagons rolled dazed, heavier than ebb. Merchants praised Dusty Hollow at a town finally modern. Young men found steady work in the mill, their pockets heavier than before. Even some of the old guard admitted quietly that maybe progress had its merits. But storms have long memories, and prosperity often hides cracks beneath its shine. One autumn, the eastern buyers slashed prices, knowing Thomas Mill had docked Dusty Hollow into contracts. Grain that once sold high was now worth barely enough to cover costs. Wagons returned half empty, debts piled high, and Thomas workers found their wages slashed. Farmers who had turned from the ledger found themselves cornered. They borrowed against promises of quick return, and now their notes came due with no grain to cover them. The steam mill, once a proud tower of progress, sat silent for weeks at a time, its gears bursting while Thomas scrambled for solutions. The town grew restless. Some blamed Thomas for leading them astray. Others blamed Clara and Ezekiel for not stopping him. Families that had once stood united now argued in the saloon, in the streets, at supper tables. For the first time since Silas Crow, Dusty Hollow felt the pull of division. Thomas, desperate, came to Clara one night, the same office where he had once dismissed her warnings. He laid his contracts on the table, eyes heavy. "They've bled us, Miss Clara. I thought I was leading us forward, but I tied us in knots instead. What do I do?" Clara, frail but sharp, reached for the ledger. Her hands shook, but her voice steadied. "You go back to patience. You tear up contracts that bleed us. You return to fair trade, not quick gain. And you right every wrong in this book so the town remembers not to chase shadows, but to plant roots." Tears pricked Thomas' eyes, pride broken at last. He took the ledger in his hands, feeling its weight like a brand. For the first time, he understood it wasn't just ink and paper, it was survival. The next day, with Ezekiel at his side, Thomas led the town in the hall. He stood tall, not with fire, but with humility. "I thought speed would save us," he admitted. "But I was wrong. Dusty Hollow was built on patience, and on patience will keep it standing. I will repay every debt my mill caused, not in silver alone, but in years of work if I must." The town, though wounded, forgave. Slowly, painfully, the ledger absorbed the shock. Farmers returned to its steady pages, debts rebalanced, trust rebuilt. Thomas Mill never fully disappeared, but it was folded into the town rhythm, bound by the same creed that had carried them through every storm. In time, Thomas Fletcher himself became one of the ledger keepers, his youthful fire tempered into the steel of patience, and Dusty Hollow endured once more. Bambitron Visikas. A Longin, Beam Unknown. Slowly, painfully, the ledger absorbed the shock. Farmers returned to its steady pages, debts rebalanced, trust rebuilt. Thomas Mill never fully disappeared, but it was folded into the town rhythm, bound by the same creed that had carried them through every storm. In time, Thomas Fletcher himself became one of the ledger keepers, his youthful fire tempered into the steel of patience, and Dusty Hollow endured once more. Not by speed, not by ambition, but by returning always to the creed that outlasted every storm. Word of Dusty Hollow spread further than any wagon road could carry. Teamsters driving herds across the plains spoke of a town where contracts were fairer than sunrise, and no man lost his land to slick clauses. Railroad men, grudging in their respect, admitted Dusty Hollow never bowed to their pressure, yet still prospered. Travelers sat by campfires and told tales of a book, just a sill, leather-bound ledger. They kept a whole town honest, where debts were paid in calves, in grain, in hours of sweat, and no man was allowed to starve while another grew fat. To Ed, it sounded like fantasy. In a West littered with ghost towns, swindled miners, and broken promises, how could such a place endure? Yet those who followed the trail long enough, those who passed the weather-eater sign at the edge of town, found the stories true. Dusty Hollow wasn't booming with gold or flashing with saloons, but it breathed a steadiness that made outsiders pause. If they'd stepped into a valley where storms broke against invisible walls. Clara's hair grew white of prairie cotton, and Ezekiel's step slowed to a shuffle. But together they guided Dusty Hollow through the turn of decades. Thomas Fletcher, chastened by his mistakes, took his place among them, carrying the weight of lessons learned. Under their care, the ledger became more than a record. It became scripture, not of religion, but of survival. It carried the story of a town that refused to gamble its soul for silver. But with legend came pilgrims. Families weary of rail towns and mining camps came westward seeking a steadier life. They arrived with wagons rattling, children dusty from the trail, hopes fragile they glass. Dusty Hollow welcomed them, not with fanfare, but with fairness. Clara showed them the ledger, explained its creed. You earn, you save, you repay, you share. That how we stand. Break the creed, and you break yourself. Most accepted, grateful for a place with promises meant something, but not on. A few bristled, muttering that Dusty Hollow was too rigid, too slow, too bound by its book. They left, seeking faster fortunes elsewhere. More often than not, word came later that those places had collapsed into ruin while Dusty Hollow still stood. As the years stacked, the town began to feel like more than wood and stone. It became an idea. Writers passing through penned articles in Eastern papers, calling it the town of the ledger. They marveled at how a community could thrive without banks or rail bosses, how fairness bound them tighter than any law. Some mocked it backward, others praised it as noble, but no one denied it was remarkable. The children of Dusty Hollow grew into men and women who carried its creed into their bones. They built barns not just for themselves, but for neighbors, knowing storms didn't choose favorites. They tallied accounts carefully, never rushing, never cheating. They told their own children the stories of Harlan Graves, of Clara Bell, of Ezekiel Clark, how they had faced famine, greed, drought, ambition, and still endured. And yet, the wider world pressed close with each passing year. Telegraph wires crept along the horizon, railroads stretched to iron fingers further west. Towns nearby grew into cities with brick streets and electric lamps. Dusty Hollow looked smaller by comparison, but it didn't shrink, it deepened. Where others built upward in noise and haste, Dusty Hollow built inward, rooting itself like an oak. One winter, a delegation of officials from the state capitol arrived, dressed in coats finer than any Dusty Hollow had seen. They wanted to establish a formal bank, backed by charters and laws, to modernize the town economy. They spoke of interest rates, of standardized currency, of ledgers larger than any one book could hold. The town there in the hall, listening, Wary but curious at last, Clara, her voice thin but sharp as awe, rose with the ledger in her arms. She laid it open before the officials. The pages, filled with decades of careful writing, glowed under lamplight like holy writ. This book has kept us through storms colder than death, through men greedier than wolves, through years of drought and years of plenty. It has never cheated a soul, never broken a family, never turned patience into chains. You owe us vaults and charters. But what we have is trust, and no law you pass can weigh heavier than that. The officials had no answer. They left with polite smiles, but Dusty Hollow did not yield. It would want. By the time Clara passed, buried beside Harrod on the hill, the town mourned in one body. The bell of the schoolhouse tolled slow, and the ledger was placed on the table, a candle burning beside it. Ezekiel, old but steady, touched its cover with calloused hands. "We'll keep it," he said simply. For her, for Harrod, for all of us, the town swore it would be so. Dusty Hollow lived on, a legend not because it grew rich, but because it refused to be broken. In a world that chased quicksilver fortunes, it chose patience. In a land where greed toppled empires, it chose fairness. And in a time when storms claimed more towns than they spared, Dusty Hollow endured line by line, page by page, storm by storm. By the turn of another decade, Dusty Hollow had become something rarer than gold. It wasn't the biggest town, nor the richest, nor the noisiest, but it was the steadiest, and in the West, steadiness was worth more than all three. Travelers spoke of it as a place half myth, that no man was ruined by debt, no family was left starving, and the only law sharper than the sheriff badge was the lines written in the ledger. New families came, drawn not by promises of sudden wealth, but by the quiet assurance of fairness. They brought their wagons, their cattle, their hopes tired from chasing fortunes elsewhere. In Dusty Hollow, they found what they had been denied, a community bound by trust. They learned the creed quickly, earn slow, repay steady, share when storms strike. Some grumbled at first, wanting more, faster, but most settled into the rhythm, realizing that in this town, patience was not weakness but strength. The ledger itself had grown thick, its pages carrying the lifeblood of decades. Horror and neat hand filled the first years. Clara, graceful script stretched across the middle, and newer entries showed the careful strokes of Thomas Fletcher. His fire cooled into steadiness. Each page was a chapter, each line a reminder. Outsiders marveled at it, saying no bank vault could hold much value that one book. For its worth wasn't in numbers, but in the trust it proved. With legend, however, came attention Dusty Hollow had never sought. Eastern newspapers began publishing stories of the town without debt, to painting it to the miracle of the frontier. Academics traveled long roads just to sit in the hall and study how a whole community could function on trust alone. And soon, politicians came sniffing too, curious how a settlement that ignored banks and charters still thrived while others faltered. One summer, a congressman from the east rode in with a retinue, his coat pressed fine, his mustache waxed sharp. He addressed the town from the porch of the schoolhouse, declaring Dusty Hollow a model for rural prosperity that sure did replicate it. He spoke of charters, printing presses, of sending the ledger lessons eastward belong. Some cheered the recognition, proud their little valley had become famous. Others shifted uneasily, worried that fame might chip away at the very patience that had built them. Ezekiel, older than most mountains by then, rose with difficulty to speak. His voice cracked but carried. Dusty Hollow don't need statues nor charters, he said. It needs what it always had. Steady hands, honest dealings, and trust that don't bend. You want to carry our lessons east? Fine, but don't try to bind us with your ink, for we've got ink enough of our own. The congressman smiled, but the sharp glint in his eyes showed he hadn't heard the warning. Not long after, businessmen came again, slicker and sharper than Silas Crow had to been. They pitched factories, stock markets, partnerships with banks in distant cities. They promised Dusty Hollow could triple its wealth in 5 years, rival cities in 10. For a moment, the town wavered. Success can tempt just as much as hunger. The younger folk, who had grown up without seeing Dusty Hollow scars, were curious. They whispered, "Why not us?" Why not bigger? Thomas Fletcher, gay-haired now but tempered by his own mistakes, led them in the hall. He laid out his early contracts, yellowed and brittle, the very ones that had nearly sunk the town years before. I was you once, he admitted. I thought bigger was better, faster was stronger, and it near broke us. Don't let polished men tell you otherwise. What we have is rarer than any city glitter. It roots, and roots don't grow by chasing shadows. They grow by holding ground. The hall fell quiet. Slowly, heads nodded. The businessmen left without deals signed, their words failing against the weight of Dusty Hollow creed. Yet storms never vanish for good. That autumn, markets in the east collapsed. Railroads cut wages, banks closed their doors, towns that had grown fat on speculation withered to husks. But Dusty Hollow endured. Its jars remained steady, its fields harvested, its debts repaid in calves and grain instead of broken notes. Outsiders flocked once more, not to tempt the town, but to survive in it. By then, the ledger was more than a book. It was an heirloom, a symbol, a testament to everything Dusty Hollow had weathered. Parents told their children that one day they might hold its pages, not to own, but to protect. This is our fence, and they said, this is what keeps storms out. And so Dusty Hollow entered its golden years, not with fireworks, not with railroads or banks, but with the quiet glow of endurance. A legend carved not in marble, but in patience. A town that proved the West wasn't only about the loud, the violent, the greedy. It could also be about the steady, the fair, the enduring. The golden years of Dusty Hollow stretched out like a calm river, deep and sure. Where other towns rose fast and fell faster, Dusty Hollow endured in the way of oak trees slow to sprout, but steady enough to outlast storms that snapped saplings clean. Its barns grew broader, its fields richer, its homes sturdier. Children who once studied by lamplight now taught their own children from the same schoolhouse bell. Travelers called it the town that couldn't be shaken, and though the people of Dusty Hollow never boasted, they wore the name with quiet pride. By then, Ezekiel had passed, his grave beside Clara, who lay beside Har Rod. 3 stones rocked the hill, plain and simple, overlooking the valley they had built. Folks often climbed there at sunset, setting flowers or just sitting in silence, listening to the wind sweep across the prairie. It was said you could hear the faint scratch of pen on paper if you listened close enough, the sound of the ledger still being written, even beyond life. The ledger itself had grown thick, heavier than any one hand could carry comfortably. Its leather cover was worn smooth, corners frayed from decades of vague. Inside, the pages told a story rich for any history book. Winters survived, debts repaid, storms endured, betrayals mended, harvests shared. Each generation had added its ink, its handwriting layered like voices in a choir. To open it was to feel the weight of Dusty Hollow very soul. As the town fame spread, people from far-off places began to arrive not to live, but to learn. Scholars came with notebooks and spectacles, asking how a community could thrive without banks or charters. Preachers came, and hoping to fold the ledger into sermons. Others humbled to find it already held a creed, deep binding in Scripture. Journalists wrote articles in Eastern papers, marveling at how Dusty Hollow wealth was measured not in gold or factories, but in trust. And yet Dusty Hollow never turned itself into a spectacle. Outsiders were welcome, but they were told the same thing every newcomer heard. The ledger don't bend. If you join us, you vow it. If you can't, then ride on. And he stayed, grateful for the fairness. Some left, muttering it was too slow, too rigid. But the town never wavered. It knew who it was, and it refused to trade patience for popularity. Generations shifted. Children who had never known famine learned the stories of Harrod, Clara, and Ezekiel as if they were legends from another world. Teachers recited high, Harrod, calves, instead of crushing. Dogs stared down eastern bankers. How but Ezekiel had carried the creed into the fields, around campfires and under porches. Elders told those tales in the same slow drawl, their voices carrying the rhythm of storms and death. But even legends faced new storms. The world beyond Dusty Hollow changed faster than them. Cities sprouted with factories and lamps. Railroads thundered across plains. Telegraph carried words faster than wind. To younger generations, the ledger sometimes felt like a relic, a weight from another age. Why not banks, they asked. Why not factories? Why not join the rush? The elders answered with patience. Because banks can fail, factories can burn, rushes can ruin. But the ledger endures. It don't promise speed, it promises survival. And survival is the only true wealth. Still, restlessness lingered. A few left the valley, chasing the noise of cities. Some never returned, swallowed by debts, by greed, by promises too sweet to be true. Those who did return often came back humbled, grateful for a place that trust was not for sale. Dusty Hollow reputation grew so wide that even in distant capitals, officials referenced it in speeches, calling it a model of community. Some proposed copying its methods into law, drafting ledger acts that aimed to bind fairness into banks and trade. Laws written on paper in far-off halls could never capture the marrow of Dusty Hollow creed. For the ledger was not dead rules. It was lived patience, trust, proof, love. Merchants continued to up offering deals that glimmered with quick coin. Some brought catalogs filled with luxuries, hoping to tempt the valley. But Dusty Hollow learned long ago that shine fades. They bought what they needed, nothing more, and sent merchants away with polite refusals. We ain't poor, they'd say. We're patient, and patient folk don't go hungry. By the close of another half-century, Dusty Hollow was less a town and more a legend written into the West itself. Travelers told of it as a place that defied the usual cycle of boom and bust. Parents in far-off places told their children, be like Dusty Hollow, slow, steady, fair. Writers penned stories, untrue, unexaggerated, but all carrying the same heart that in a world of greed and storms, there was a valley that chose patience and endured. And through it all, the ledger remained. Pages still filling, its ink dark, its creed alive. Dusty Hollow did not fear the future, for along as storms came, along in greed tempted, along in ambition whispered, the ledger would hold them steady. For the town had learned the oldest truth of all, that gold is fleeting, silver tarnishes, railroads rust, but patience outlasts everything. As the decades unrolled like a wagon road stretching into horizon, Dusty Hollow moved past being a settlement and even past being a town.
It became a rhythm of life, a creed so ingrained that children learned it before they could spell their names. Save, steady, repay, fair, share, and storm. Oh,
The ledger itself was kept in the town hall, its pages now too heavy for any one person to carry. Families would read their children there on their first day schooling, letting them touch the worn leather cover, they have to anchor them to something older than memory. Generation rose and fell. The faces that had once filled the cool house faded into photographs, then into stories, then into names on gravestones up on the hill. Harlan, Clara, Ezekiel, Thomas, all of them had long since crossed into legend. Their likenesses were remembered only through retellings. Their voices echoed only in stories shared by firelight. Yet the work they had laid down, the creed etched into every page of that ledger, still carried Dusty Hollow forward. The world outside grew louder. Factories smoked. Cities blazed with electric lamps. Newspapers carried headlines that seemed to change faster than storms. Wars rumbled in distant places. Fortunes rose and fell in markets built on speculation. Banks failed. Companies collapsed. Towns boomed and vanished in the span of a generation. But Dusty Hollow remained, steady at ebb. Its barns still painted against the prairie sun. Its jars still filled with coin. Its people still bound by the simple truth that had always guided them. Patience outlasts. Travelers who stumbled into the valley after long roads often described the place as stepping out of time. There were telegraph poles, later wires strung for electricity. Even motor cars rattled down the main road, but beneath it the town breathed the same rhythm it always had. Deals were struck not with slick words, but with steady eyes. Debts were written not in abstract numbers, but in calves, in seed, in hours of sweat.
And no matter the year, no matter the storm, the ledger page is filled line by line, its ink carrying the heartbeat of a community that refused to break. Children who grew restless sometimes left, chasing cities, chasing progress, chasing fortunes. Many never returned, but did, older, humbler, worn down by the weight of debts and betrayals in places where patience had no place. They came back to Dusty Hollow with empty hands but grateful hearts, ready to start again under the creed they had once dismissed. And the town welcomed them, not with scorn, but with the same steady patience it gave all storms you repay when you yield, they were told. You build slow, you stand long.
And so they did. As the centuries edged on, stories of Dusty Hollow began to spread beyond the West entirely. Historians wrote of it as a model community, an example of resilience. Economists marveled at how a town without traditional banks or corporations had thrived while others collapsed. Poets found in it the quiet romance of endurance, a counterpoint to the restless hunger of the modern age. And still, round fires and rainy nights in classrooms, the tale was told not with numbers or charts, but with the old voices. How one man with a mule and a ledger had set the first line, and how a town had chosen to endure it since. The ledger itself grew so thick that it became a series of volumes, each one bound with leather, each one treated like an heirloom. The first Harrod original was sealed in glass, too fragile now for common handling. Clara pages, Ezekiel tallies, Thomas confessions, all of it preserved life scripture. Later generations added their own, each volume a chapter in a story that never ended. Together they filled shelves in the hall, a library of patience, each line written proof that Dusty Hollow had stood against time itself. Strangers who visited often asked the same question, the same one children had asked for centuries. Did Harrod graves really exist? Was Clara Bell real? Did Ezekiel Tal walk these fields? And always the answer was the same, spoken by elders with the patience of 1,000 storms. It don't matter if they were flesh or old story. What matters is the creed is alive, and that makes them as real as you or me. By then, Dusty Hollow was no longer just a dot on a map. It was a parable. Schools far away told its story. Writers called it the Ledger Town too long. One even doubted its reality, thinking it too steady to be true. But for those who walked its dusty streets, who heard the bell ring over the valley, who saw the pages of the ledger with their own eyes, there was no doubt. Dusty Hollow was real and it endured. And so, even each centuries passed, as the world grew unrecognizable, Dusty Hollow held fast. Not because it had gold, not because it had walls, but because it had chosen the oldest wealth of book, patience, fairness, trust. In a world that burned itself out chasing speed, Dusty Hollow remained its steady land and flame on a rainy night, blinding all who found their way to it. Time has a way of wearing down even mountains, but it never wore down Dusty Hollow. While other places rose to cities, grew fat with industry, and then crumbled into the dust of their own excess, the Hollow remained steady as stone. The world outside grew stranger. Louder railroads gave way to motor cars to machines that hummed with electricity, telegraphs to telephones, newspapers to radios. But in Dusty Hollow, the ledger was still opened each morning. A hand still dipped its pen, and a line was added to the story of patience. By then, the town had seen more generations than anyone could count. Graves on the hill grew thick, markers weathered with smooth by prairie wind. Families who had been there since Harron time traced their line back with pride, while newcomers, no matter how recent, became part of the same long weave of trust once they placed their names in the ledger. Outsiders often marveled at it, how no one in Dusty Hollow was left behind, how debts were handled like responsibilities instead of shackles, how no greed was allowed to grow large enough to poison the soil. In distant places, where wealth rose and fell with markets, and banks crumbled and governments strained, the story of Dusty Hollow began to sound more like myth than history. Preachers in far-off cities told of the ledger people who chose trust over greed. Professors lectured on how one small valley had defied centuries of storms without it abandoning its creed.
Slower and outside grew stranger. Louder railroads gave way to motor cars to machines that hummed with electricity, telegraphs to telephones, newspapers to radios. But in Dusty Hollow, the ledger was still opened each morning. A hand still dipped its pen, and a line was added to the story of patience. By then, the town had seen more generations than anyone could count. Graves on the hill grew thick, markers weathered with their smooth like prairie wind. Families who had been there since hard-won time traced their line back with pride, while newcomers, no matter how recent, became part of the same long weave of trust once they placed their names in the ledger. Outsiders often marveled at it, how no one in Dusty Hollow was left behind, how debts were handled like responsibilities instead of shackles, how no greed was allowed to grow large enough to poison the soil. In distant places, where wealth rose and fell with markets, the banks crumbled and governments strained, the story of Dusty Hollow began to sound more like myth than history.
Preachers in far-off cities told of the ledger people who chose trust over greed. Professors lectured on how one small valley had defied centuries of storms without it abandoning its creed. Children in schools that had never seen the plains were taught to be as compared Dusty Hollow. The name itself became shorthand for fairness. Of course, with fame came doubters. Some scholars scoffed, claiming the town was use of parable stitched together from frontier folklore. No community could endure that long without corruption, they argued. No book could bind people stronger than law. They wrote papers dismissing the ledger air allegory, a symbol rather than a thing of leather and ink. And yet, whenever travelers actually found their way to the valley, they came back with the same wide-eyed report. It real. The ledger real. The creed is alive. In Dusty Hollow itself, the people didn't care much for outside debate. They kept living things they always had, slow, steady fare. They built houses with their own hands. They raised barns with neighbors. They sent their children to the same schoolhouse whose bell still rang every morning. The telegraph wires above their heads, the radios in their parlor, even the glowing lamps in their windows, none of it changed who they were. They would take what was useful, but they would not trade their soul for speed. The ledger by then had become a whole library. Bound volumes filled shelves in the hall, each one marked by the era it held, the winter years, the drought years, the golden years, the years of plenty. The first volume, horrid on, rested in a glass case. Its ink faded but still legible, its cover cracked with age. Visitors often stood before it in reverence, as if they were gazing at Holy Writ. Children pressed their hands to the glass, whispering as if the book could hear them. The townsfolk treated it with respect, but not worship. It ain't the book that saved us, elders reminded the young. It's the creed inside it. The book that keeps us honest. That distinction was the heart of Dusty Hollow. The ledger was proof, not magic. The magic was the patience of the people who filled it. Still, as the centuries rolled on, the story of Dusty Hollow began to stretch beyond even reality. In new places, preachers spoke of Harad, the prophet, who had brought the creed down from a mountain. In others, Clara was remembered as a saint who guarded the town's soul against corruption. Ezekiel was cast safe, the strong shepherd of the valley. Thomas is the prodigal son redeemed by patience. The truth blurred with the telling, but the heart stayed the same. Patience endures, greed destroys, trust binds. Even in the world outside grew unrecognizable. Dusty Hollow remained like an anchor, a living reminder of what endurance looked like. Politicians invoked its name. Reformers used it as a rallying cry. Writers painted it in novels as a place of almost mythical steadiness. Yet if you asked the townsfolk, they'd shrug. We do what we've always done. We keep the ledger. We keep each other. That all? And so Dusty Hollow became less a place on a map and more a symbol carved into time. For those who lived there, it was home, plain and simple. For those who heard of it, it was legend. And for those who believed, it was proof that in a world that burned itself out chasing shadows, patience could still light a lantern bright enough to last the night. As centuries deepened into ages, Dusty Hollow became less a settlement and more a touchstone. Its barn still stood, its schoolhouse bell still rang, its ledger still opened each morning, but the world round it shifted like a restless sea. Empires rose and fractured, wars swept across continents, markets soared and collapsed, yet through it, Dusty Hollow endured. To outsiders, it became a puzzle almost unbelievable. How could one valley resist the storms that felled giants? How could one book bind a people tighter than any crown or constitution? Scholars traveled from across the world to study the place. They expected to find secrets in the ink, complex systems, clever schemes. But all they found were simple lines. Debts repaid in calves, jars of seed tallied, hours of work balanced against need. They left bewildered, unashamed, others humble. It isn't numbers one wrote, it's character.
Character can't be manufactured. The hollow itself never sought the world gaze. People didn't see themselves in miracle or myth as it delivered the tree. A man planted his field knowing his neighbor would lend seed if frost struck. The widow knew the town would let her children go hungry. A boy could borrow tools and repay with labor, not fear. The ledger made sure of it, not by punishing, but by reminding. We write it down so we don't forget, the elders would say, and forgetting is the quickest road to ruin. In time, the world grew as biz. Dusty Hollow became a pilgrimage. Travelers came not to strike it rich, but to sit in the hall and run their fingers along the bindings of the ledgers. They came to climb the hill that Haran, Clara, and Ezekiel laid, to whisper thanks into the prairie wind. They came to see a town that patience was not mocked but honored. Some stayed, weaving themselves into the creed. Others returned home with stories that lit fires of reform elsewhere. The legend of Dusty Hollow stretched so wide it no longer belonged to the valley alone. Poets wrote epics, casting it at the heart of the frontier. Politicians quoted its creed in speeches. Teachers in distant countries told their students to keep the ledger a metaphor for living honest and steady. And slowly the details blurred, as details always do.
Tyler became less a man and more an archetype. Clara less a teacher and more a guardian saint. Ezekiel less a rancher and more a shepherd of people. The truth softened into para, yet the heart remained. Some wondered if the hollow itself might one day vanish, swallowed by the very time it had outlasted. Roads paved over, cities spread close, the world pressing against its borders. But the people of Dusty Hollow never feared that, for even if the town itself were lost, the ledger creed had already outgrown it. The story was too large, the lesson too deep. Dusty Hollow could not die, because it lived wherever patience endured. And so the tale was told not just around campfires, but in temples, in schools, in homes across the earth. Parents touched children with it. Leaders invoked it. Reformers carried it. Be like Dusty Hollow, they would say. Build slow, save steady, share in storm, endure. By then, the valley had become both real and myth. For those who lived there, it was still fields, barns, and neighbors who knew your name. For those far away, it was an eternal symbol, proof that communities could be stronger than greed. For the world at large, it was a reminder that wealth is not in gold nor speed, but in trust written line by line, storm by storm.
So Dusty Hollow told the patience endured into legend, bolder than hell, but lighter than the rafters of civilization, casting steady light into a storm good snuff. As centuries folded into one another, the edges of history blurred, and Dusty Hollow began to slip from broth into legend. Maps grew crowded with new cities, new borders, new names, while the valley that once seemed the whole world to its people became just another stretch of prairie to outsiders. The cool house bell rusted silent. The barns leaned under the weight of age, and even the ledger itself protected, preserved, recopied into volumes faded from daily views. But the creed, the marrow of the town, refused to die. People told stories long after the hollow streets were quiet. They spoke of a place where no one starved in winter, where debts were fair, where neighbors carried each other through storms. They spoke of a man with storm-gray eyes who wrote the first lines in a crooked office. They spoke of a teacher whose pen was a steadier voice, and of a rancher whose calloused hands kept the creed alive in the soil. And though their names softened with retelling, their essence endured. In distant cities, Dusty Hollow became a para, told in sermons, in classrooms, in quiet conversations between those who had known hunger and betrayal. Keep the ledger, they'd say, not meaning an actual oath, but the spirit of patience.
To this it meant saving a little each day, no matter how small. To others, it meant standing firm when slick talkers came with promises too bright. To others still, it meant never letting greed break the bonds of trust. The words changed with each tongue, but the heart was always the same. Patience outlasts. Generant, who had never seen the valley still, invoked its name. They painted murals of Dusty Hollow if it were Eden itself, barns golden in sunlight, neighbors' death shoulder to shoulder, a great book resting in the center like scripture. Poets sang of it to the town that endured, philosophers cited it to prove that human nature could choose trust over greed. Children in faraway lands grew up believing it might be a story, a dream, a guiding star, but whether it was fact or fable no longer mattered. And in truth, the hollow itself may have faded. Storms may have weathered its last timbers, grass may have swallowed its streets, the prairie may have reclaimed what man had once carved. Travelers searching for it may have found only silence, a wide sky and wind in the grass. But even if the place was gone, the story remained, for Dusty Hollow had never truly been about barns or ledgers or even people. It had been about the creed they lived to build slow, to endure storms, to hold trust like the only coin that never lost value. In time, entire movements rose under its banner. Reformers in distant countries carried banners stitched with its name, demanding fairness in trade and honesty in law. Writers invoked it when markets collapsed, reminding people that patience could outlast ruin. Even centuries later, when the world had changed beyond recognition, Dusty Hollow lived on, not in wood and soil, but in the marrow of human hope. And so, whether it stood in a town or ole memory, Dusty Hollow became one of the great myths of civilization. It sat beside the oldest stories told on firelight, of journeys, of floods, of oaths that shaped peoples. It whispered to every generation the same truth, simple and unshaken. Gold fades, silver tarnishes, kingdoms fall, but patience endures. And though no one alive could say if Haron Graves had truly walked the prairie with his mule, or if Clara Bell had written lines by lantern glow, or if Ezekiel Fart had carried calves through snow, every listener knew in their bones that it was true. Because Dusty Hollow was not history, it was creed. And creed, once rooted, never dies. When the last remnants of the frontier had long been paved over, when nations that once stretched wide had risen and fallen into dust, the name of Dusty Hollow still lingered in whispers. It had drifted too far from geography to be found on any map. Cartographers who combed the old prairies found no schoolhouse bell, no barns, no crooked office where Harrod once set pen to page. The grass had swallowed it whole, and the wind had scattered its timber. Yet the story was still told, carried in tongues that never knew the valley soil. In that far-off age, people spoke of Dusty Hollow the way they spoke of ancient cities or holy places that may or may not have existed. To them, it was the last true town of the old world, where men and women learned to live by fairness instead of conquest. To others, it was a symbol only, never a real settlement, but a tale crafted to remind folks that trust was possible. A myth, yes, but a myth that bound itself to reality tighter than any monument could. Songs were written of it, slow and mournful, sung in places that storms still threatened lives. They told of a valley where no one went hungry, where every debt was counted fair, where greed never found purchase. Poets invoked it in the lantern in the storm, a light that guided travelers long after the lantern itself had gone dark. Parents told children that when they saved a little, when they kept a promise, when they shared in lean times, they were walking the road of Dusty Hollow. Historian argued, of course. Some dug for records, piecing together fragments from faded newspapers, dusty archives, scattered journals that spoke of Harrod Graves and his ledger. They debated whether Clara Bell had dead existed, whether Ezekiel Cater was a real rancher or a symbol of labor itself. But even the most skeptical did not explain away the endurance of the story, whether it was real or not. One scholar wrote, "Its truth is lived in the marrow of those who owe it." Dusty Hollow has become more powerful than fact and has become necessary, and indeed in places where greed had broken communities, debt had crushed families, people turned to the parrot of the ledger. They copied its creed into their own books. They founded small groups, carved hollows, little circles of trust, where debts were repaid in work, in seed, in kindness. These hollows sprouted far from the old prairie, in cities of stone and iron, in villages by the sea, in mountain hamlets half a world away. None of them were the original Dusty Hollow, but all of them claimed its spirit. The story itself shifted with each tongue. In one telling,
Harrod was a wise wanderer who taught a starving village how to save. In another, Clara was the true founder, a woman who defied bankers with nothing but her pen. In another, Ezekiel was remembered as a farmer who carried entire valley on his shoulders. The details changed, blurred, sometimes contradicted one another, but the creed remained the same. Build slow, save steady, share in storm. And so Dusty Hollow lived not at a town, but at a compass. In times of chaos, people turned toward it, whether or not they knew where it once stood.
It was not nostalgia. It was survival, carried forward by story when all else failed. There were even whispers in quiet places that Dusty Hollow had never been swallowed by time at at. Some claimed you could still stumble upon it if you traveled far enough into the wide prairie, if you walked long under a sky heavy with stars, if you carried patience in your heart. They said you'd find a bell ringing faintly, a light in a crooked window, and a book open on a table waiting for your name. Most dismissed it as fantasy, but still, in storms, when roads grew uncertain, travelers prayed to find that hidden valley. And perhaps that was the truest proof that Dusty Hollow had become more than history. A place can vanish, a eld can rot, a book can fade, but a creed, once rooted in the marrow of people, will outlast all three. Dusty Hollow no longer needed walls or streets to endure. It lived in every promise kept, every debt repaid fair, every act of patience in a greedy world. And so long after its barns had fallen and its bell had silenced, Dusty Hollow remained timeless, unbroken. A lantern carried not by one town, but by countless souls who believed that patience outlasts all storms. Ages turned at slow pages. Then the world that once knew Dusty Hollow by name passed away. Nations rose and fell, languages shifted, cities grew so vast they swallowed whole landscapes, then crumbled to silence.
The prairies themselves changed, tilled and paved, swallowed by roads and towers, and later by silence at Eid, when those towers fell. The name West meant nothing to most ears anymore, for the maps had been redrawn too many times, yet through it one thread remained unbroken. The story of a valley very patient had outlasted storms. By then, Dusty Hollow was no longer told to place it out, but that a myth older than memory. In one age, it was remembered dead, the first settlement, where men and women learned to bind themselves not by kings or gold, but by trust. In another, it was called the Valley of the Ledger, a paradise of balance where no greed to take root. In yet another, it was told that the lantern in the storm, a guiding light in humanity's darkest winters. Each tongue shaped it differently, but the marrow stayed the same. Patience was the only coin that never lost its worth. No one could say anymore if Harrod Graves had truly walked the earth, if Clara Bell had truly written her careful script, if Ezekiel Caird had truly carried calves through the snow. To Nost, they were figures of story archetypes. Harrod became the first keeper, Clara the guardian of ink, Ezekiel the shepherd of soil. Their faces were imagined differently by every age, sometimes weather farmers, sometimes robed sages, sometimes even figures of light, but their essence never changed. They were the hands that first wrote the creed, build slow, repay fair, share in storm. And still the creed endured, not the law, but to scripture whispered in hard times. In villages far from any prairie, parents still told children, remember the ledger. They meant, keep your promises, count what matters, endure. In places where greed had broken whole cities, reformers invoked Dusty Hollow as proof that fairness was possible. In songs sung under rainy roofs, lovers promised each other not riches but patience, for patience was the truest wealth. Some cultures claimed Dusty Hollow had never been earthly at it, but a vision, a divine place glimpsed by humanity in its youth and carried forward in memory of what could be. Others insisted it was real, buried under soil somewhere, waiting to be found again. Pilgrims wandered searching for it, believing that if they walked long enough under open skies, they might stumble upon a valley where the air itself breathed trust. Some claimed they had found it, though no proof ever followed. But the myth didn't need proof. The creed was its proof. Even when the world became unrecognizable, when machines carried men across oceans in moments, when voices traveled through air without wires, when cities gleamed brighter than stars, the story of Dusty Hollow still found its way into hearts.
And later still, when those gleaming cities fell, when silence reclaimed the land, the story lived on. For stories once rooted deep are harder to kill than stone.
Juma exprime de remain de informatie en nek te drukken back her. That may het zijn markers a civil name. But he caught and the message to it whatever you be. Kon dat could say on the summer. Van de ex me. Het kan zo even week niet door ook even er maar hoek. We met van mij. Dat was je kan lezen in the mind of the feather and bad things do what the case. The creed of patience could not be broken. Please, I never got scored out eight. When people don't like to even remember the work the West had made, but they still remember Dusty. I'll live to say, well, they still shut.
It was that long after the barns had fallen and the schoolhouse bell had rusted to dust. Dusty Hollow survived in the only way that mattered, not in timber or maps, but in the marrow of human hope, the timeless myth, a steady lantern, a reminder that no matter how strange the world became, the creed of patience could not be broken. And in that far-off age, when people no longer even remembered what the West had been, they still remembered Dusty Hollow, not as history, not as geography, but as scripture. To them, that was enough. There came a time when even the fainted trail of history had washed away. The languages that once carried the names of Harrod, Clara, and Ezekiel had shifted into new tongues, their words bent and reshaped until they no longer resembled the syllables spoken in that little valley. Maps of nations long gone had yellowed to dust. Towers once thought modern had fallen into ruins and been built over 1,000 times again. The earth itself bore no mark of Dusty Hollow barns, its schoolhouse, or its crooked little office, or the first ledger had been written. And yet the story lived on. By then, Dusty Hollow was no longer remembered as a town on a prairie. It had become a first place at origin. In no cultures, it was told of the cradle of humanity wisdom, the spot where the first people learned not to hoard but to share. In others, it was imagined deed, a divine valley, not of earth but of spirit, where eternal keepers tended the ledger of all souls. To still others, it was the forge where patience itself was born, hammered into the fabric of the universe. The figures had transformed too. Har-Raed was remembered not as a man with storm-gray eyes, but as the first keeper, a primordial teacher who shaped order out of chaos. Clara had become the guardian of ink, a timeless scribe who held back corruption with the stroke of her pen. Ezekiel was remembered as the shepherd of soil, a great figure who carried the weight of life through endless winters. Thomas, once restless and flawed, was retold as the prodigal, proof that even those who strayed from patience could find their way back through humility. They were no longer individuals, they were archetypes, living symbols woven into the story of creation itself. Whole civilizations used the myth to shape their codes. Some built councils hauled hollows. The debts were settled not in coin, but in fairness. Others kept books modeled after the ledger, where each entry was sacred and every name bound by trust. In distant lands, storytellers recited Dusty Hollow Creed before harvests, before voyages, for wars, reminding people that storms could be endured only if bonds held steady. Save steady, repay fair. Share in storm mercy. Words echoed through temples, schools, and homes, long after their original form had been forgotten. And yet, despite the layers of myth that had wrapped around death, the heart of the story never changed. It is not about power, nor conquest, nor riches. It was about patience, simple, quiet, enduring. In ages of greed, the myth rose as warning. In ages of famine, it rose as hope. In ages of chaos, it rose as anchor. Dusty Hollow had become one of humanity's eternal myths, of fundamental as fire, as steady as stone. Some scholars of those distant ages argued over its truth. Was Dusty Hollow of real? Was it merely allegory? Was it possible that somewhere in the bones of the old world there had once been a valley where these people lived? Pilgrims searched for ruins, digging through layers of earth for signs of barns, bells, or ledgers. Some swore they found fragments, timbers darkened by age, coins buried in jars, scraps of faded ink. Others dismissed it as wishful thinking. But whether or not the place was proven, the creed remained alive, and that made the story true in the only way that mattered. Children of that far-off age grew up with Dusty Hollow, not the history, but to compass. They were told that when they saved something for tomorrow, they were writing in the ledger. When they kept a promise, even when it hurt, they were standing in the hollow. When they shared their last crust of bread in a storm, they were part of the valley that never died. Dusty Hollow became less a story and more a mirror, reflecting the best of what people would choose to be. And so, in an age where no one remembered the West, where the word prairie meant nothing, Dusty Hollow endured. It lived not in timbers or bells or barns, but in the marrow of belief. It had become scripture without religion, myth without gods, a guiding lantern carried across millennia. And though the world would keep changing, burning, building, falling, the lantern would never go out. For patience endures, trust endures. The Dusty Hollow, born from dust and storms, endured with them. There came a day when the voices that once spoke the name of Dusty Hollow were no longer human. The civilizations that had carried the story through centuries burned themselves out, some in war, some in hunger, some in their own restless chasing of shadows. The world turned quieter, its great towers fallen, its rivers flowing indifferent through ruins. But silence did not kill the hollow, for by then it had already slipped beyond the fragile threads of history. It lived in story, and stories drift further than flesh. Wanderers of the New Age, beings who walked on legs of metal or oars woven from circuits, still carried tales of an ancient valley where trust bound people stronger than chains. They no longer remembered what West meant, nor what kind of fields once grew there, but they remembered the creed. They repeated it to each other when storms, now of fire and steel instead of snow and wind, threatened to rake them. Save steady, repay fair, share in storm. It did not matter that their barns were gone, that their ledgers glowed with light instead of ink. The creed was the same. Far across seas and places untouched by memory of prairies, Dusty Hollow had been reshaped into pure myth. Some told it of the story of the first covenant. The ancient beings learned not to devour one another but to live in balance. Others told it a dream of the earth itself, whispering patience into the marrow of creatures who would otherwise burn themselves away. In these tellings, the names of Har-Rod, Clara, Ezekiel were barely remembered, twisted into sounds unrecognizable, yet their roles keeper, guardian, shepherd remained, archetypes that outlasted even language. What was left of humanity, scattered Danes, traveling under skies dark with storms of their own making, clung to Dusty Hollow at anchor. They carried fragments of the ledger, recopied countless times, sometimes into symbols so altered that no scholar could trace them back. But the heart remained clear, a balance of giving and taking, of saving and sharing, of surviving storms together. And when they told their children the story, they no longer spoke of barns or jars or prairie grass. They spoke of a lantern, a small light in endless dark, kept alive because a people had chosen patience over greed. And long after even those voices faded, the myth still wandered. Creatures who came after humanity, whether born of soil or stars or the old machines left behind, learned to speak of a valley where storms never won. They could not say where it was, nor when. They knew that it was. That somewhere in the marrow of existence there had always been a hollow where trust mattered more than gold. What patience endured when oaths failed. Perhaps they found echoes buried deep, an old book beneath stone, pages eaten by time but ink faintly clinging, a bell cracked but still able to ring when the wind touched it, a coin in a jar worn smooth but still carrying the weight of hands that once saved it for another. Perhaps they found nothing at it but the story itself, drifting like wind. Yet it was enough. For the truth of Dusty Hollow had never been in relics. It had always been in the choice to endure. So the myth outlived even the people who birthed it. It became part of the deep current of life, a fundamental of fire, a patient as stone, not history, not memory, but creed. And thus, in age A, no one remembered what humanity had built. Dusty Hollow still endured, not at a town, nor even at a legend, but a law of survival written into the bones of creation. Storms come, greed tempts, time devours, but patience endures, always. When old reckonings of time had lost their meaning, when calendars had rusted into dust and stars themselves were drifting apart, Dusty Hollow still lived on. Not in memory, not at legend, but at rhythm, a natural and endless as the beat of a heart. It was no longer spoken in stories alone. It had become one of the truths of existence, a law that moved beneath the surface of creation, as certain as gravity, as steady the tide in that far horizon of eternity. And no voice remembered barns or ledgers or prairie skies. There was still the whisper of a creed. Build slow, save steady, share in storm. It was no longer tied to people nor to place. It had become a cycle. Stars born in dust carried it, shaping worlds where life learned patience or perished. Civilizations that rose too fast, burning bright, collapsed. Those that learned to hold steady, to endure storms without breaking trust, endured. The story of Dusty Hollow had become more than myth. It had become the pattern by which worlds lived or died. Across galaxies, you beings, creature of light, of thought, of shapes no man could have named, told stories that echoed the hollow. They spoke of the first valley, where order was chosen over chaos, with bonds held stronger than storms. They did not know the name Harrod Graves, yet they knew of the first keeper. They did not recall Clara Bell's script, yet they spoke of the guardian of ink. They did not remember Ezekiel calloused hands, yet they honored the shepherd of soil. The details had been washed away by eternity, but the roles endured, eternal archetypes carved into the marrow of existence. Somewhere in the infinite drift, a fragment of the old world might still have rested, a cracked bell buried under soil, a scrap of ink fading on parchment, a coin smoothed by centuries of touch. Perhaps so travelers stumbled upon it, holding it in their strange hands without knowing its origin, yet feeling the weight of patience in it. Perhaps not. Perhaps Dusty Hollow left no relics at that, but relics were never the toit. The fate was the creed, and that creed had seeped into creation like rain into soil. And so Dusty Hollow became not history, not legend, not even myth, but principle. It was recited not this story, but to law. Storms will come, greed will tempt, time will erode, but patience outlasts. Always. Just as fire burns, just as stone endures, just as rivers carve canyons, Dusty Hollow creed had become one of the elements. In the quiet reaches of eternity, when even suns burned low and galaxies thinned, there was still the lantern. Not a lantern made by men's hands, but the eternal flame of patience, the one that had been kindled in a crooked little office when Harrod Graves set ink to the first line. That flame had burned through centuries, through nations, through the end of humanity itself, and still it burned. For patience was not mortal, patience was not fleeting, patience was the marrow of endurance, the law that no storm could erase. And so Dusty Hollow, born of dust, storms, and trust, lived forever. Not at a town, not at a people, but at a truth of existence. A lantern hung in the rafters of creation itself, steady, eternal, unbroken. At the farthest reaches of our reckonings, when the stars themselves dimmed that coals and silence spread wider than oceans, there was still a whisper. It was not carried by mouths, nor by wind, nor by ink on a page. It was carried in the marrow of existence, the steady hum that lies beneath all storms. And in that whisper was the story of Dusty Hollow. It no longer mattered that barns had once stood there, painted against prairie sun. It no longer mattered that a crooked little office had once smelled of ink and dust, where a man with storm-gray eyes wrote the first line of a ledger. It no longer mattered that a teacher hand had steadied the gook through storms, or that a rancher back had carried it through hunger, or that a restless youth had tested its creed and then bowed to it. All of that had passed into the long forgetting, and yet none of it was gone. For Dusty Hollow was never about barns or names or ink. It was about choice. The choice to endure when storms came. The choice to save when greed tempted. The choice to share when hunger threatened. Those choices had been made so many times, by so many hands, that they had carved themselves into the fabric of being. And so even when memory died, the pattern lived. In the last ages, When suns collapsed and darkness grew vast, the story began day. New sparks of creation bloomed out of silence. Galaxies spun like campfire sparks flung into night, and in their rising was written the same old creed. Somewhere in Zo Valley on Zo World, beings death close against storms. They built slow, saved steady, shared in lean times. They may not have known the name Dusty Hollow, but they were its children all the same. And if one of them, that wanderer in that new age, asked an elder where such patience had begun, the elder might smile into the firelight and say, long low in a hollow of dust, where storms raged and men chose not greed but trust. The young might frown and ask if it were true, if such a place really existed. And the elder, with the same patience carried through eons, would answer they always had. It is real wherever its creed is alive. Thus the story circled back to its first telling, a tale by firelight on a stormy night, a whisper of patience against the roar of greed. It had no beginning now, no end. Dusty Hollow had become eternal, a lantern flame that flickered not in one valley, not in one age, but in none of them. And every time it was told, it was new. Every time it was lived, it was born in. For storms will always come, greed will always tempt, time will always erode, but patience endures. And so Dusty Hollow endures, not that a town, not at a myth, but to the steady truth that guides all who choose to endure with it. And in that way the circle closed, and in that way the circle began there. Even after the circle had closed and opened again, Dusty Hollow did what it had always done. It lingered. Not at a fixed place in soil or stone, but that a thread weaving through every story told by firelight, every song sung against storm, every oath spoken between hands clasped in trust. It became less of a tale about a town that once was, and more of a living pattern, rising in different shapes wherever beings struggled to survive together. On one world, under twin suns that scorched fields into dust, a people whispered of a valley that had endured by planting deeper than heat would burn. They did not call it Dusty Hollow, for that name was long gone from their tongues, but the bones of the story were the same. They spoke of a keeper who tallied fairly, of a guardian who recorded truth, of a shepherd who carried life through lean years. Their children, born into drought, repeated the creed before planting seeds in cracked earth. And when the rains finally returned, they said the hollow had kept its promise once more. On another world, wet endless ice covered the land and storms shrieking across frozen seas, tribes carved the story of the hollow into stone tablets so it wouldn't be lost in blizzards. They imagined it at a lantern burning under snow, a warmth that never faded no matter how fierce the winds grew. Their ledgers were not of ink, but of shells, bones, and beads, each one standing for trust given and returned. And though no barn stood there, no prairie rolled under wide skies, the creed was alive just the same, far across the stars, in a place where beings were made of light and thought. The hollow was remembered not as a valley, but as a frequency, a hum that resonated in every bond of trust. They sang it instead of speaking it, harmonies that wove patience into the very fabric of their lives. And when disagreements rose among them, they sang the old chords again, reminding one another that storms could be endured only if they held steady together. The shape changed, but the heart did. Dusty Hollow was never meant to be one town, in one place, in one age. It was meant to be seed. Once planted, it sprouted wherever it was needed. A lantern here, a valley there, a song somewhere else. Sometimes it wore names, sometimes it wore only silence, but it always endured. Even in ages when civilizations grew so fast they nearly burned themselves away, there were always a few voices reminding them of the hollow. They spoke of patience, aid wealth greater than gold, of fairness, strength greater than armies, of trust as shelter stronger than walls. And sometimes they were ignored, sometimes mocked, sometimes silenced. But when storms came, and storms always come, the creed was remembered, and those who remember it survived. There were myths that one day, at the end of all things, when stars burned low and silence covered the last of creation, the hollow itself would appear again, not a memory, not a symbol, but a place. A valley lit by lantern light, waiting for all who had carried its creed. In that place, the keepers would stand once more, not legend, but dead figures, familiar, family. Harlan with storm gray eyes, Clara with her steady script, Ezekiel with his strong back and humble heart, Thomas with his fire turned to wisdom. They would open the ledger and welcome every soul that it had chosen patience over greed. And there, beyond storms and beyond endings, the story would begin again. Whether that myth was true or not never mattered. What mattered was that it gave people courage to endure, to save, to trust. And in that courage, Dusty Hollow endured, infinite and unbroken. For the Hollow was never about where you stood, it was about how you stood. And along its storms raged and patience endured, the Hollow was alive, always. In the eras that followed, Dusty Hollow drifted further from its prairie cradle, yet closer to the heart of every people who needed it. The Hollow was no longer remembered at one place or one story, but as many. It became a canvas each age painted with its own colors, yet always with the same brushstrokes, fairness, patience, endurance. Among desert nomads who crossed dunes, endless oceans, the Hollow was remembered as an oasis that never dried. They told of a spring that flowed as its people never hoarded more than their share. Their ledgers were not books, but circles scratched in sand, smooth each evening so that tomorrow could be counted anew. When merchants offered them contracts rich with promises, they laughed and said, "We already keep the Hollow," and in their laughter was survival. Among mountain dwellers who built their homes in stone cliffs, Dusty Hollow became a cavern of warmth deep beneath ice. They carved runes on the walls, symbols of debts repaid in timber, grain, or labor. Children learned to read those runes before they could walk the narrow paths. When avalanches came, when storms howled, they led in the cavern and sang of the Hollow, believing the rock itself remembered the creed. Even in glittering cities of steel, with towers rose like forests of iron, the story found a home. Workers told it to one another in tenement halls, passing it down when wages failed and hunger pressed. For them, Dusty Hollow was a union, a bond of hands held together so no one was cast out alone. Their ledgers were chalk marks on walls, tallying hours worked and meals shared. And though the city tried to swallow them, the Hollow endured in their unity. In distant futures where ships drifted between stars, the Hollow was remembered as a station of refuge. Pilots whispered of a port where no one was cheated, where fuel was shared in lean times, where the only law was fairness. Some swore they had docked there, seen the glow of its lanterns on the edge of dark space. Others claimed it was old story, a myth born of longing. Yet the tale kept weary travelers alive, reminding them to trust when loneliness tempted despair. The story bent, reshaped, adapted. Sometimes it was told at a valley of earth, sometimes at a cavern, an oasis, a port, sometimes at a light within, but it never vanished. It could not, for Dusty Hollow was not bound by place, it was bound by choice. And every time a people chose patience over greed, endurance over collapse, the Hollow lived again. Still, there were always skeptics. In every age, it argued it was nonsense, a fairy tale that distracted from reality. What valley like that existed, they said. What ledger can hold back storms? Yet when famine came, when storms roared, when greed shattered their homes, it was the Hollow they reached for, and those who remembered its creed endured when others fell. The skeptics called it chance. The believers called it patience. But patience doesn't care what name you give it. It endures all the same. And so the Hollow became part of the great circle of human story. Against just in fire was remembered in myths of gods stealing sparks, just as floods were remembered in legends of survival. Just as journeys were told dust of spirit, so too was Dusty Hollow carried to the myth of endurance. It sat beside the oldest tales in the marrow of culture, unshaken, unbroken. In the end, Dusty Hollow had never been about a valley of dust it had. It was about the truth all valleys, all towns, all peoples must face. Storms will come, greed will tempt, hunger will press, time will erode, and the only wealth that outlasts is patience, measured line by line, trust by trust. That truth was eternal, and so Dusty Hollow was eternal. As ages passed, the telling of Dusty Hollow became more than words. It turned into ritual, a cycle woven into lives so deeply that even those who no longer remembered the name still carried its essence. In every place which storms threatened survival, the Hollow found new breath. Among the sea-bound, who sailed endless waves under skies that never showed land, the Hollow was remembered at an island that never sank.
Sayolo told tales of a keeper who marked debts not in coin but in fish caught. Storms endured and sails mended. Their ledger was the mast itself, etched with lines for each voyage, each return. At night, when a sailor fell ill or lost his catch, the others gave without hesitation, saying, "The hollow keeps us all afloat." And when tempests broke masts and swallowed ships, those who survived clung to that creed tightly. They clung to driftwood. In great deserts of iron and glass, the cities of the old world had shattered and left old ruins. Scavengers whispered of the hollow in a refuge where no one cheated trade. They marked their debts in stones stacked in careful rows, each stack proof of a promise kept. Children born among the wreckage learned early that survival meant fairness. Take too much and storms would claim you. They spoke of the hollow as a place not of fields or barns, but of balance, and the ruin itself bent to patience. In forests that grew so thick their canopies blotted out the sun, tribes carved the hollow into their chants. At gatherings, they recited the roles: the first keeper, the guardian of ink, the shepherd of soil. To them, the hollow was a clearing lit by eternal fire, where ancestors dead to weigh deeds fairly. They called it in their prayers before hunts, before marriages, before planting. They did not know barns or schoolhouse bells, yet they knew the rhythm: build slow, save steady, share in storm. Even in places where beings no longer had flesh, where thought itself lived in woven light, Dusty Hollow endured. They carried Sikhs, a pattern of balance coded into their existence. When disagreements rose, they invoked the hollow bades, a program of fairness, resetting quarrels back to equilibrium. They no longer spoke the old names, yet the functions remained keeper, guardian, shepherd. They became less characters and more roles written into the structure of survival itself. And so Dusty Hollow spread not to one story, but to many rituals. Lanterns lit in storm, stones stacked in circles, marks carved into wood or steel, chants sung before harvest, tallies written in ledgers of light, all of them different, yet all of them the same. For the hollow was not bound to one form, it was the shape of trust itself, and trust always finds a vessel. Still, in quiet corners, said remembered, pilgrims traced their way back to the prairie, or what they believed was the prairie. They walked grasslands under vast skies, searching for signs: a cracked bell, a buried coin, a scrap of ink faded in dust. Sometimes they claimed to find them, sometimes only silence. But every time they told the story, they rekindled it. The hollow lived not in relics, but in the retelling, in the breath of those who refused to let patience be forgotten. In each age, skeptics mocked. They said no valley had endured so long. No wolf could keep greed at bay. No creed could bind people forever.
But when storms rose, when greed broke the careless, when time swallowed the proud, those dame skeptics whispered the hollow in secret. They may not have believed in barns or ledgers, but they believed in survival. And survival was what the hollow promised. Thus the hollow was no longer simply remembered, it was enacted. It was ritual, as steady as sunrise, as necessary as breath. People planted it in their lives without knowing its origin. They carried it into futures where names faded but essence endured. Dusty Hollow became less of a story and more of a pulse, a heartbeat that never stopped, no matter how much the world changed. And through all those retellings, through all those rituals, the truth stayed simple. Storms will come, greed you tempt, time we erode, but patience endures. Always. In the far stretches of time, Dusty Hollow ceased to stand apart at a tale of one valley or even one people. It became woven into the tapestry of existence itself, merging with other myths, other fireside stories, until it stood as one of the pillars beneath all culture. Just as every people had a flood story, or a story of fire, or a story of the first journey, so too did every people come to carry the hollow. It was told in countless tongues, sung in countless songs, etched into countless rituals. Some called it the Valley of Patience, others the Eternal Ledger, still others the lantern that endures.
But no matter the shape, it was always the same heartbeat beneath trust, balance, endurance. In lands where rivers cut through stone like veins, they told of a keeper who measured the water so none would thirst. In icy wastelands, they spoke of a guardian whose ink never froze, marking fairness even in endless winter. In islands scattered like jewels across the sea, they sang of a shepherd who carried fruit through storms so no child starved. The names changed, the faces blurred, but the roles never vanished. Keeper, guardian, shepherd, the triad that kept balance alive. And though ages rewrote details, one element never shifted: the creed itself. Build slow, save steady, share and storm. Those words, in whatever language they were shaped, anchored people when the world tilted. Farmers whispered them that seed fell into soil. Sailors sang them the waves threatened to swallow their ships. Parents taught them in lullabies. Lovers swore them of vows. Leaders carved them into law. The creed was the marrow of Dusty Hollow, and marrow cannot be separated from the bone of survival. By then, skeptics had stopped asking if the hollow was real. The question had grown meaningless. It did not matter if barns once stood on a prairie, if a bell once rang over a schoolhouse, if a man with storm-gray eyes once bent over a ledger. What mattered was that the story lived wherever patience was chosen over greed. The hollow is real wherever the creed is lived, elders said.
And in that sentence, truth was closed about a circle. Some philosophers of that age went further, teaching that Dusty Hollow was not but a story remembered by people, but a pattern inscribed into existence itself. They argued that every storm in creation was a trial, and every act of patience was proof of the hollow at work. To them, the hollow was not a myth among others, but the steady lantern guiding Ein myths. It was not one parrot, but the parrot, the root from which all others branched. But whether or not they were right, the idea itself endured, for it matched what people already felt. That survival had always belonged to those who remembered the hollow, whether by name or by instinct. In time, festivals rose around it. Lanterns were lit across cities, across villages, across ships sailing under alien skies. At those festivals, people tallied their debts, forgave what could not be repaid, and shared food so none were left wanting. They called it keeping the ledger, though no leather book lay open before them. The book was in their lives. Children played gate around bonfires, chanting the creed. Storytellers recited the roles of the hollow, not distant figures, but the voices alive within every listener. The keeper in their discipline, the guardian in their memory, the shepherd in their compassion. And so Dusty Hollow was no longer just told. It was lived, breathed, embodied. It was ritual, it was compass, it was song. But it was no longer that one story among many. It was the pulse beneath all stories. Wherever beings endured storms, there the hollow was. Wherever greed tempted ruin, there the hollow warned. Wherever patience saved, there the hollow lived. It had become, by then, eternal, not in barns or bells or ledgers, but in the marrow of existence itself. A lantern not hung in one valley, but in all valleys, not lit once, but forever. There came a time when Dusty Hollow was no longer spoken of, but story had I. The names of Harrod, Clara, and Ezekiel had long since melted into the great river of legend, their faces blurred into archetypes, their words reshaped into chants older than language itself. But the essence of the hollow had outlasted even story. It had become something greater, something like gravity, like fire, like the rhythm of seasons, not remembered, not debated, simply there. In that age, scholars no longer searched archives for proof of a valley on the prairie. They studied instead the patterns of survival itself. Why did us civilizations endure while others collapsed? Why did peoples weather storm after storm while others shattered at the first gust? And in every study, in every equation, the same pattern emerged. Endurance was patience. Prosper that lasted was always born of restraint. Communities that outlived centuries were always bound by trust. The hollow was no longer myth to them. It was law. The ledger had become a principle of reality. Inevitable is tide. The creed was recited not in stories, but in formulas, in axioms. Build slow systems that rush, collapse, save, steady resources shared, endure longer than those hoarded. Share in storm resilience is collective, never solitary. These truths appeared in mathematics, in philosophy, in physics even, for they matched the rhythm of creation itself. Stars that burned too hot died fast. Rivers that flooded unchecked carved ruin. But those that flowed steady gave life. The hollow was written in the bones of the cosmos, and people finally saw it for what it had always been. Not advice, not para, but principle. And yet, despite this shift from story to law, the hollow still carried the warmth of myth. Lanterns were still lit at festivals, ledgers still rocked in ritual. The keeper, the guardian, and the shepherd were still invoked, though now less that the figures of memory and more and faces of the law itself. They became like constellan in the sky, eternal shapes reminding people that patience was not just wisdom, it was the structure beneath all things. Some went further still, declaring Dusty Hollow to be the axis of creation. They taught that existence itself was a ledger, each life a line, each choice a debt or a credit, each storm a test.
Both slow, they saved steady, they shared in storm. Not because a story told them to, but because the law of existence demanded it. To ignore it was to collapse. To embrace it was to survive. It was not choice, not parable, not myth. It was as simple in that, certain breath. A soul the hollow outlived time itself. Not in barns, not in bells, not even in stories. It outlived because it had always been more than those things. From the very first storm, endured in a crooked office on the prairie. It had been more than a town. It had been the shape of endurance, the pattern of survival, the lantern flame that was not lit once, but forever, and forever it would remain. In the bound and the drift of time, when beginnings and endings blurred into one, Dusty Hollow ceased to be something told about and became something simply known. No one needed to ask whether it was real, for it was as real as the seasons, a constant as breath, and steady as the turning of the sun.
It did not matter if Barnes had stood, or if a man named Harrod had truly leaned over a ledger by lantern light. The hollow was no longer a matter of memory or history. It was the pulse of existence itself, repeating in every age, reborn wherever storms pressed upon living things. On worlds green with forests, the hollow was whispered as roots that held trees upright through wind. On worlds scorched by fire, it was spoken in the ember that survived flame and lit new growth. In cities that never slept, it was etched into code and law, reminding on that greed devoured faster than it built. Among scattered tribes walking ruins of forgotten empires, it was sung at night in low chants, guiding them through hunger and grief. The hollow was no longer just one people creed. It was the marrow of countless peoples, bound together not by name but by rhythm. The keeper, the guardian, the shepherd, these figures endured not as names but as eternal roles, like shadows cast by light itself. Children in faraway lands were told that each of them lived in their hearts. The keeper was patience in their planning. The guardian was honesty in their memory. The shepherd was compassion in their hands. And when storms came, storms of snow, storms of fire, storms of greed or war, their parents reminded them steady. The hollow endures through youth. And so the hollow became an eternal cycle. Each age thought it had discovered it anew. Each age believed it was the first to write the creed, to tell the story, to light the lantern. And in truth, each age was the first, because the hollow never asked for ownership. It was always born again, where it was lived. That was its secret, its strength. Dusty Hollow never needed to be remembered perfectly to endure. It only needed to be lived. Somewhere in that endless span, philosophers declared that Dusty Hollow was not myth nor law, but infinity itself. What endures past time, they wrote, must be time root. Dusty Hollow is the circle by which all circles are drawn. Although many argued over such grand words, the truth was simple enough to need none. Storms pass, patience stays. That was all. In the deep silence between stars whose civilizations flickered to sparks, the hollow burned steady. Its creed was passed in lullabies, in carvings, in code, in rituals, in whispers. And even when tongues forgot its name, they remembered its truth. When one generation planted slow for the next, the hollow was alive. When neighbors shared what little they had, the hollow was alive. When debts were counted fair and storms endured together, the hollow was alive.
No tombstone could hold it, no library could contain it, no ruin could erase it. For Dusty Hollow had outlived everything but patience itself. It had become the lantern of infinity, an endless flame carried from hand to hand, from age to age, never dying, always steady.
And so the hollow endured always, even when the very idea of history had thinned to whispers. A dusty hollow remained. It no longer needed pages of ink, nor barns, nor bells. It had dissolved into the marrow of story itself, a current that ran beneath every tale told in every age. No matter the language, no matter the world, no matter the shape of the people who spoke it, the hollow was there, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always alive. In distant times when the stars themselves had grown old and faint, whole cultures rose and fell around the telling of the hollow. Some ordered the first garden, where life had chosen patience over ruin. Others named it the circle, the place which storms were faced not by walls but by open hands. Still others spoke of it as the ledger of the cosmos, where every act of kindness or greed was tallied not in ink but in the balance of creation itself. Whether they pictured barns or temples or stars, the marrow of the creed never changed. Build slow, save steady. Share in storm. On worlds far-flung and strange, the hollow became the foundation of ritual. Pilgrims lit lanterns not in memory of a prairie town, but in recognition of the eternal flame of endurance. Communities there each cycled to forgive debts, not because they remembered Harrod's first page, because they felt in their bones that survival demanded fairness. Children played games that echoed the roles of keeper, guardian, and shepherd, never knowing their origin, yet embodying their essence. Even when names had shifted beyond recognition, the triad endured patience, honesty, compassion. Some ages grew so restless they tried to outrun the hollow, building empires of speed and greed. They scoffed at patience, mocked restraint, worshipped the storm instead of the lantern. And for a while, they burned bright. But storms always return, and greed always devours. And when collapse came, as it always did, it was those who still kept the hollow who survived to carry forward. The pattern was Ed steadied the tide. Those who lived by patience endured. Those who mocked it were swallowed by silence. Philosophers of the late ages argued not whether Dusty Hollow was real, but whether reality itself was Dusty Hollow. They wrote of the ledger ray the spine of the universe, a balance woven into the stars, a script that shaped everything from the orbit of planets to the bonds of trust between neighbors. To them, Harrod, Clara, and Ezekiel were not people but eternal archetypes, the first names given to truths older than suns. Whether the story had been born on a prairie or in the marrow of existence didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. What mattered was that it endured. And so Dusty Hollow became not just myth, not just ritual, not just law. It became identity. To live at was to live in its circle. Every being that chose patience was writing in the ledger. Every being that repaid fairly was keeping the flame. Every being that shared in storm was Dusty Hollow itself, reborn again and again, as steady as a lantern in the dark. Even when the stars grew few, when silence pressed heavier than storms, the hollow was not broken. For it had never truly been about place or people. It had always been about choice. And choice endures long and there is breath, though long and there is light, the long and there is any being left to say, patience outlasts. Thus, Dusty Hollow, born in dust and storm, lived forever. Not in wood, not in stone, not even in story alone, but in the eternal circle of endurance itself. Dusty Hollow did not end when memory ended, nor when history ended, nor even when stars ended. For it was never bound by barns, nor books, nor even the hands that first wrote its creed. It had seeped deeper into the very pulse of existence until it was no longer a story told but a law lived. And so, as the wheel of age turned and turned, the hollow kept showing its face, shape-shifted but unchanged, silent but unbroken. In one age it was sung Zen, the hymn in the balance, a melody carried by wanderers who had no land, only each other then. Their verses spoke of storms endured, debts forgiven, gifts shared. They claimed the song itself came from the first valley, carried through time by voices unbroken. To sing it was to keep the lantern lit, no matter how dark the road. In another, it was kept the covenant of stones. Communities carved circles of rock, each stone standing for a debt or a promise. When storms came, they there that the circle removed what had been repaid and added what still needed keeping. No one remembered the word ledger, but the circle served the same purpose. It was balance made visible, patience made solid, and when children asked what it meant, the elders told them, "These stones are us. When one falls, we'll fall. When one stands, we'll stand." Elsewhere, it became a light woven into ritual. Nomads carried lanterns through endless migrations, passing flame from one family to the next. Each said the flame was older than memory, a spark first kindled in the valley where patience outlasted greed. To let the flame die was unthinkable, not because it could not be relit, but because to extinguish it meant forgetting the hollow, and forgetting was the only true ruin. Even in realms far from earth, where beings no longer had flesh or fire, the hollow endured.
Lived a code, a pattern written into the foundation of their shared existence. Whenever systems threatened collapse, whenever greed twisted logic, a hollow pattern realigned them, restoring balance. They did not call that Dusty Hollow, nor know of prairies or barns, but they knew the hum: build slow, save steady, share in storm. To them it was the equation of survival, a law no system could break without breaking itself. And so the hollow was everywhere, always. Not because anyone remembered its origin perfectly, but because its essence was the marrow of survival itself. It returned in drought, in famine, in ruin, in silence. It returned wherever storms pressed against fragile lives. It returned wherever beings chose trust instead of greed. And each time it returned, it proved again what had been true since the first ink line in a crooked office: patience endures. Some philosophers of those endless ages said Dusty Hollow was proof that existence itself was circular. They argued that the universe did not expand and collapse for no reason. It breathed, but the hollow breathed. At the ledger turned page after page. Every cycle they wrote is the hollow beginning again. And perhaps they were right, for every age rediscovered it, as if it were brand new, as if Harrod pen had just set ink to paper. The hollow was always ancient and always newborn. Thus, Dusty Hollow stretched beyond memory, beyond story, beyond even myth. It became a constant, like gravity, like fire, like breath.
It did not need to be spoken to be real. It was real, but it lived. And so long in anything, anywhere, chose patience in the face of storm. Dusty Hollow lived on steady, unbroken, eternal. Dusty Hollow no longer needed names, nor places, nor even language to endure. It had become like the hush for a storm, like the steady rhythm of waves, like the warmth of fire against cold night. It was the unseen law that bound survival to death, older than memory, stronger than greed, unbroken by time. Where there was life, there was hollow. Where there was endurance, there was ledger. Where there was patience, there was lantern light. In one corner of existence, it surfaced as the ritual of balance. Entire civilizations paused at the turning of seasons to weigh what they had taken against what they had given. They built great halls filled with glowing marks, some written in ink, they etched in stone, but carried in light itself. When debts could not be repaid, they were carried together, so none bore more than they could carry alone. They did not know they were reenacting a prairie town creed, but they lived it a truth. In another, it rose as the Song of Three. Whole cultures sang of three eternal voices, one that counted, one that remembered, one that carried. They called them by new names, in new syllables, but the echo was unmistakable.
The keeper, the guardian, the shepherd transformed into music, rising and falling like breath. Children learned the song before they learned speech, and when storms broke against them, they sang it louder, believing the harmony itself could keep them whole. Elsewhere, the hollow survived dense the circle of giving. Each generation dared to place their gifts at the center of their community, grain, tools, time, knowledge. In return, they drew what they needed with no fear of greed, for the circle itself bound them. They told themselves that as long as the circle remained unbroken, storms could not destroy them, and in their sharing, they endured. Even among the farthest stars, where beings drifted in silence across endless void, Dusty Hollow was alive. They carved its essence into the very design of their vessels, ensuring that energy was shared, resources recycled, lives sustained. Today the creed was to doom the whole, to keep it was to endure the void. They no longer spoke of ledgers or lanterns, yet every system whispered the hollow rhythm: balance, patience, trust. The skeptics of those ages did not ask if the hollow was real. They asked instead how it could be everywhere. How could a Z story born of dust and storms shape itself into so many forms? And the answer, though simple, silenced them. Because it was never Jet's story, it was law. And law cannot vanish. It only wears new clothes. Thus Dusty Hollow lived in both myth and marrow, though parable in principle. It was story for those who needed story, law for those who sought reason, ritual for those who craved practice, song for those who needed hope. It was whatever each age required, and yet always the sage flame at its core. That was why it endured when nations fell, when stars burned, when memory itself was swallowed. The Hollow had become more than legend. It had become the eternal pulse of survival. And so wherever storms raged, wherever greed tempted, wherever time pressed, the Hollow appeared to gain. Sometimes they'd valley, sometimes they'd song, sometimes it's law, sometimes they'd silence, but always as the same steady lantern in the dark. Patience endures always. By then, Dusty Hollow no longer needed storyteller to keep its flame alive. It breathed in the marrow of every act of patience, in every choice to save instead of squander, in every open hand that shared during storms. It was no longer spoken on something remembered, but felt as something inevitable. Like gravity pulling rivers toward the sea, and though the details shifted with every age, the lantern flame of the Hollow never dimmed. On a world where skies burned copper and storms raged daily, the Hollow was remembered as the calm stone. Tribes carried it with them, a polished rock that passed from hand to hand. Each time it was given, it bore witness to patience, a reminder that storms would pass, but only if people endured together. They did not recall barns or bells, yet they carried the same truth in their palms. Among beings who lived in towers that floated above endless oceans, Dusty Hollow was told the anchor. They said it was the first weight that steadied them against tides, a truth heavier than waves. Their ledgers were knots tied into ropes, each knot a promise, each untied loop a debt repaid. Children learned the knots before they could swim, fingers weaving patience into every cord. They did not know of Harrod or Clara, but they knew the creed, written in rope and tide. Far away in realms where light itself was language, the Hollow was seen a pattern. Beings of radiance shimmered in colors that carried meaning, and when they spoke of trust, they glowed with the triad path. Hewn for counting, one for remembering, one for carrying. They taught it the first pulse, the shape beneath all others, and though they had never seen prairie grass or mule tracks, they carried the Hollow with every flicker of their light. Even in ruins of forgotten civilizations, we survivors walked among bones of towers. The Hollow endured. They scratched it into walls, painted it on scraps, whispered it to their children as lullaby. Storms come, greed tempts, time erodes, but patience endures. They did not care where it began, they cared that it kept them alive. And alive they stayed, because the Hollow was more than memory. It was instinct, sharpened by ages of storms. Somewhere across eternity, philosophers began to say aloud what had always been true. Dusty Hollow was not born once. It was born wherever patience was chosen. The crooked office and the first ink line were one birth, yes, but not the only one. Every time a people planted seed, they would see harvested. Every time a debt was repaid fair, every time a gift was given in hunger, the Hollow was born in. It had countless births, countless forms, countless voices, and yet one heartbeat. That was why it could not die. The old names had become so distant that they lived only echoes, unrecognizable syllables folded into chants and prayers. Yet the archetypes endured. The keeper was patience in planting. The guardian was memory and truth. The shepherd was compassion in carrying burdens. They were not people anymore. They were the eternal roles life required to endure. And though no one remembered their faces, everyone lived their essence. Thus, Dusty Hollow stretched on, carried not in barns, nor bells, nor ledgers, but in every lantern lit against dark. Each flame was the Hollow reborn. Each act of patience was the ledger rewritten. Each choice to share was the shepherd's step into storm, and every age that carried it proved once more nothing outlasts patience. And so the Hollow was not past. It was not future. It was always. A circle without beginning, without end. Steady there the flame that first burned in a valley of dust and still burns everywhere. Storms have yet to pass. The hollow was never bound by one telling, nor by one world. It drifted like smoke across eternity, reshaping itself into whatever form each age needed most. Sometimes it was a valley with barns and bells. Sometimes it was a flame passed hand to hand. Sometimes it was a pattern, a law, a chord in the music of creation itself. And always, beneath those shifting skins, was the same marrow patience that endures storms. On a distant world of endless twilight, where the sun never rose nor set, the hollow was remembered as the still hour. People marked time not in days or nights, but in steady rhythms of planting, harvesting, sharing. They said the still hour was the heart of all survival, the quiet balance that outlasted even a sky frozen in dusk. Their ledgers were shells placed in circles, each one standing for trust earned and repaid. They may never have known of prairie winds, yet the same creed guided them through silence, build slow, save steady, share and storm. Among nomads who traveled endless ice plains, the hollow was the hearthstone. Each clan carried one, warmed by fire and guarded fiercely. To them, the hearthstone held the memory of all debts and promises, glowing brighter when bonds were strong, dimming when trust was broken. My children learned early to keep it glowing, not with magic, but with fairness. They knew no barns or mules, but the shepherd spirit lived in every head that carried fire through winter. In vast sky sits where beings floated on wings of light, Dusty Hollow was remembered to the first flight. They believed the ledger was not a book, but the air itself, carrying every choice into balance. The keeper was the one who rocked the winds, the guardian the one who remembered their patterns, the shepherd the one who bore others aloft when wings faltered. They had no fields, no jars of seed, but they spoke the same creed before every journey. Patience is the only flight that never falls. Even in barren places where ruins stretched for leagues, the children played among broken towers and whispered of ages gone. The hollow was still there. They carved its words into stone, painted them on walls, sang them in cracked voices. They had little left but story, and yet story was enough. For story carried them through hunger, carried them through despair. And in every telling, Dusty Hollow lived again, as steady as a flame that had never gone out. Some thinkers of those endless ages said aloud what had always been felt. Dusty Hollow was the proof that endurance is not an accident, but a choice. Storms come to all, but only those who choose patience survive them. Greed tempts all, but only those who turn it aside endure. Time erodes so, but those who build slow leave roots deep enough to last. That choice, they said, was the true hollow. The valley had only been its first voice. Every age since had spoken it in new tongues, but the heart was the same. The keeper, the guardian, the shepherd, these roles no longer needed names, for they were written into every being. To lay carefully was to honor the keeper. To hold memory true was to honor the guardian. To carry burdens for another was to honor the shepherd. They were no longer figures of legend, but faces of endurance itself. And every time a storm was endured, every time greed was refused, every time patience was lived, Dusty Hollow was there. Thus the hollow became not history, not even myth, but the eternal rhythm of survival. It was the pulse beneath every age, the lantern light behind every storm. And though tongues forgot the name, though maps lost the place, though time erased the details, the hollow endured always. Dusty Hollow flame flickered through every form life could imagine that never dimmed. When one age forgot it, another rediscovered it. When one tongue buried it under new names, another raised it again in song, and so it wandered like the wind, unseen yet felt untouchable, yet undeniable. The hollow was not chained to barns or ledgers or bells anymore. It had become a current that ran beneath all existence, steady as heartbeat, endless as horizon.
On a world where cities floated on rivers wider than seas, the hollow was remembered as the balance bridge. People built bridges of rope and wood that swayed but never fell.
'cause every hand helped bind them. They said the bridge was the ledger itself, each plank a debt, each knot a promise, each crossing a test. Children learned to walk the bridges whispering, share the weight, share the way. They may never have seen prairie fields, yet the same creed guided their steps. Endurance is carried together. In lands of glass deserts, lay sunlight cut the ground into shards. The hollow was told, out the shade. Travelers spoke of a great tree that never withered, its branches wide enough to shelter all. They said the tree grew not from soil but from patience, watered by trust. Its leaves shimmered like lanterns at dusk, each one a promise kept. In its shadow, no one was left athirst. They had no memory of barns or bells, but they knew the shepherd heart, carrying life through fire. Among people who carved their homes into the sides of mountains, the hollow was the echo. They believed the world itself remembered every word spoken, and that fair words returned its shelter, while selfish ones returned at ruin. They told their children that to speak greed was to call avalanche, but to speak fairness was to call safety. In their echoes, the ledger lived.
They could not have described hurried ink or Clara careful hand, but they lived by the same truth. The words you write, spoken or ink, bind you. Even among beings who lived in stars themselves, Dusty Hollow burned. They saw it as a flame that flared only when they shared light. To hoard brightness was to collapse, but to pass it on was to endure. They sang of the hollow as the first spark, a fire that had kindled Dell creation. And though their bodies were made of plasma, their songs carried the same creed. Storms pass, patience stays. So the hollow was not remembered in relics or ruins, but in choices. It lived every time a debt was repaid fair. It lived every time food was shared in hunger. It lived every time a storm was endured without breaking. The details, barns, bells, ledgers, were dust now, scattered by time, but the marrow of the creed could not be broken. Philosophers, gazing into the long span of ages, finally stopped asking if Dusty Hollow was real. They began asking instead, how could it not be? For every age carried it, every people told it, every life that endured storm lived it. It was too constant to be coincidence. It was too steady to be mere fail. They said Dusty Hollow was not an origin but a circle, no beginning, no end, only rhythm repeating along an existence itself.
That's like just a hill. Don't it?
And so the hollow endured in memory, not in story, not even in myth, but to pulse. Wherever there was patience, the lantern was lit. Wherever there was trust, the ledger was written. Wherever there was endurance, the hollow stood silent, unseen, eternal. Dusty Hollow was no longer tied to prairie grass or barns or mules pulling plows through soil. Those details had long ago drifted like smoke. What remained was essence sharper and steadier than any ruin, patience as wealth, fairness as law, trust as lantern. Across every age in shapes uncounted, that essence kept finding its way back into the marrow of living things. The hollow was not remembered. It was lived, and in being lived, it was eternal. On a world drowned in endless rain where people built cities on stilts above floodwaters, the hollow was known as the High Beacon. Families kept lanterns burning at the highest points of their homes. Flames passed from one generation to the next. To them, the flame was not just light, it was their ledger. Proof that even in storms that never ended, endurance could outlast despair. They did not know the name of Har-Ra, nor Clara Hand, nor Ezekiel's strength, that they kept the hollow alive in every lantern lit against the rain. Among mountain herders whose flocks grazed on cliffs above clouds, the hollow was remembered as the line of rope. Each family tied their rope to another, weaving bridges strong enough to carry all. They said no rope would span the gorge, but our ropes together could. Children grew up learning knocks before words, each knot a promise. They never heard of Dusty Hollow barns, but the shepherd creed was alive in their hands, binding them together above the abyss. Far across the stars, in void ships travelers drifted between suns. The hollow was carried as a pact of air. Air was rationed with fairness, shared without greed, and debts were recorded not in coin, but in breaths granted. Pilots taught their apprentices. Air hoarded is death, air shared is life. The ledger keeps itself. They may never have seen soil, but they live the same truth. Survival is patience written in breath. In distant ages, but beings were woven of sound instead of flesh. The hollow was not a place, but a note. They hated the deep tone, the vibration that outlasted dissonance. Their legends told of three voices, the keeper, the guardian, the shepherd, singing in harmony so strong that storms themselves stilled. They did not remember the prairie, but they remembered the chord, and every time they sang it, the hollow lived. Even in ruins, when silence pressed heavier than storms, the hollow endured. Survivors carved it into stone walls, whispered it into children's ears, carried it in rituals that outlasted memory. They no longer told of ledgers or lanterns, that they still recited, build slow, save steady, share in storm. They may not have had that in Dusty Hollow, but Dusty Hollow was what they were keeping alive. Philosophers of those timeless ages said the hollow was proof that survival was never about conquest or speed, but about balance. They argued that the universe itself was a ledger, storms its trials, time its keeper, and though their words took many shapes, their meaning was always the same. Endurance is not accident, it is creed, and that creed is older than stars. Thus, Dusty Hollow had become more than memory, more than story, more than myth. It had become one of the steady laws of existence, like the gravity that pulled rivers to seas, like the fire that turned cold to warmth, like the silence that followed storms. It was the lantern behind all things, burning steady, unseen, unbroken, and so it endured. They had always had. Dusty Hollow was no longer a matter of telling or remembering. It had become the hidden rhythm behind survival itself. Wherever storms rose, wherever hunger threatened, wherever greed gnawed at the edges of trust, the hollow emerged again. And if the universe itself could not let it go, it was not bound to place, nor time, nor tongue. It was bound to choice. And choice, once set into the marrow of existence, will always return. In one age, it was the law of the circle. People led every season to lay down what they had and take up only what they needed. They rocked debts in rings carved into the ground, each one rubbed smooth by countless feet. The young asked why it was done, and the elders answered, because storms come, and when they do, only those who keep the circle endure. They had never heard of Harrod Ledger, yet they kept its creed alive in soil beneath their steps. In another, it became the lantern rite. Whole cities darkened themselves once each year, extinguishing every flame until the world was swallowed by night. Then, at the heart of the silence, one lantern was lit. Its flame passed from hand to hand, spreading through the city until every home glowed again. They thought it remembrance of the first light, a fire carried through storms. They had no memory of barns or prairie bells, yet they relit Dusty Hollow flame with every generation. Among ocean dwellers who carved their homes beneath the waves, the hollow was spoken in the breath. They measured debts not in coin or ink, but in shared oxygen, in breaths exchanged from one to another. Their ledgers were shells etched with markings, traded back and forth.
No one breathes alone, they taught their children. The hollow breathes through us all. They knew nothing of Clarabelle's steady hand, but they honored her guardian role every time they rocked the shell with fairness.
Among sky roamers who sailed winds on living wings, the hollow was sung in the updraft. They said it was the current that lifted the weak, the balance that held flight steady when storms came. Their ledgers were feathers woven into ropes, each feather a promise of help, each rope a reminder of unity. To them, the hollow was not a town, but the very wind that bore them, patient and unbroken. Even in lands of ruin, yet people huddled in the bones of collapsed empires, Dusty Hollow survived. They had no ledgers, no lanterns, no barns, only story. A story was enough. They told their children of a place where storms came but trust endured, where greed knocked but was denied, where people shared and lived. They did not know if it had to have been real, but in telling it they made it real again, and in living it they proved it true. Philosophers of those ages wrote long words about it, calling it the axis, the root, the eternal flame. Some argued it was proof of divine order. Others said it was the shape of survival, nothing more. But all agreed. Patience was not just a virtue, it was the only wealth that outlasted storms. And Dusty Hollow, in whatever shape it wore, was that patience given voice. Thus, through ages uncountable, the Hollow flowed on, sometimes as stone, sometimes as flame, sometimes as law, sometimes as song, but always had the same lantern burning behind the dark. Always he the same creed written in marrow, always he the same choice whispered against the roar of storms. If so well out passed into silence, Dusty Hollow endured not a place, not a story, not a myth, but the eternal circle, steady of breath, unbroken at time. By the time memory itself had become scattered dust, Dusty Hollow no longer existed as a tale told from lips to ears. It had become a rhythm that breathed itself into every age without needing a storyteller at it. Like a river cutting canyons, like roots anchoring trees, like stars spinning in the dark, the Hollow moved unseen but steady. It no longer mattered if anyone remembered barns or bells or the crooked desk where a man once wrote the first lie. What mattered was that its essence had seeped so deep into existence that nothing could erase it. On a world of endless storms where lightning never ceased, the Hollow was known as the safe ground. People there carved circles of stone that drew power from the ground and shielded them from the fury above. Each circle required all to build, each stone set in place by many hands. They said survival itself demanded fairness. No one stands unless all stand. They had no word for ledger, yet every circle of stone they built was Dusty Hollow reborn. In another age, among a people who lived in cities of glass spun across canyon, the Hollow was remembered as the thread. They wove strands of crystal between towers. Each lies strong, owned and joined with countless others. They spoke of a weaver who taught them that one thread could snap, but 1,000 together it would bear storm. Children traced their hands across the glass lines, whispering the hollow holes. They never knew of Clara Penn or Ezekiel calves in the snow, but they carried their spirit with every woven thread. Among wanderers who sailed black oceans between stars, Dusty Hollow survived to the pact of shadows. In the void, a betrayal meant death. They swore oaths not in words, but in silence. Each silence shared was a promise that air, warmth, and shelter would never be hoarded. Their ledgers were invisible, written in trust itself. They did not call it hollow, yet their lives beat with its marrow, patience, fairness, endurance. In forests that glowed with light of their own, where beings carved their homes in living wood, the Hollow was told of the everroot. They said odd trees were connected by roots deep below the ground, sharing water, food, strength. The Hollow is not one tree, they taught, but the root that feeds them all. Their children played under canopies, whispering thanks to the root, never realizing they were repeating the oldest truth of all survival is shared. Even in ages of ruin, when dust covered everything and silence seemed final, Dusty Hollow flickered back to life. People there in caves, scratching into stone, 3 shapes, 3 roles, 3 truths. The keeper, the guardian, the shepherd. They no longer knew their names, yet they drew them over and over. With their hands remembered what memory had lost, and with every carving, the Hollow was made real again. The skeptics of such ages had grown fewer, for doubt was pointless. Too many had lived the creed, too many had endured storms because of it. The question was no longer, did Dusty Hollow exist? The question had become, can anything exist without it? And the answer was always the same, no. Without patience, greed consumed. Without fairness, bonds broke. Without sharing, storms devoured. Dusty Hollow was not a story. It was the proof that life itself had always been built on endurance. And so the Hollow stretched outward forever, shaping itself into stone, into flame, into song, into silence, into law. Its lantern burned behind every storm, behind every ruin, behind every rebirth. And though its names changed, its marrow never did. Dusty Hollow had become eternal, not in place, not in history, but in essence. Storms will always come, greed will always tempt, time will always erode, but patience endures, always. By now, Dusty Hollow was not bound to language at act. Words were fragile things, broken by time, reshaped by tongues, forgotten in silence. But the Hollow no longer needed them. It lived in the marrow of actions, in the way lives carried one another through storms. Had slipped past story, past history, past memory. into the quiet foundation of endurance itself. You could not erase it, because it was not written in ink or stone. It was written in the way survival had always been possible. Together, patient, fair, on a world where sun never rose and only fireflies lit the dark, the hollow was remembered as the glow. Villages tended jars of light passed from one home to another. No family hoarded them, for to hoard light meant plunging neighbors into shadow. Children learned from birth that every glow belonged to all. They never knew the word Nern, yet every flicker they carried was Dusty Hollow burning anew. Among beings who carved their lives into shifting sands, the hollow was the oasis sea. They spoke of a well that never dried, kept alive as all gave more than they took. They drew circles in the sand each morning, promises renewed with the sunrise. When storms swallowed their tents, when thirst pressed their throats, it was the oasis they clung to. And though they had never heard of Clara Ink or Ezekiel Toil, they lived her memory every time they redrew the circle. Far beyond, in ships drifting between broken stars, the hollow was the breath covenant. Every traveler swore to share air, warmth, and hope. They said betrayal would suffocate them all, but fairness would see them through. Their ledgers were breaths counted in rhythm, one for all for one. They had no bell to call them to order, but the hollow silence of space itself reminded them daily survival means patience kept step. Among mountain peoples who lit fires in caverns carved by ice, the hollow was the hearth pack. At every season turn, they placed food into the center of the hall, each family giving what they could, each family taking only what they needed. They taught it balance, but in truth, it was the ledger alive again. And though they never spoke the name Harad, they honored his spirit in every meal that left no one hungry. Even in crumbled ruins, we nothing but ashes remain. Dusty Hollow was not gone. Survivors traced its shape in dust, telling their children of a place where storms had come but patience had outlasted. It does not matter where it was, they said. It mattered that it is. And in that sentence, the hollow truth burned steady, brighter than any ruined silence. Philosophers of such late ages no longer argued about origins. They saw the hollow in proof that existence itself had a spine. Stars burned out when they hoarded fuel too fast. Civilizations collapsed when greed grew unchecked. But patience, always patience, was the thread that kept things whole. They said the hollow was not myth, nor story, nor even law, but the very axis upon which life turned. To live without it was to collapse. To live with it was to endure.
And so Dusty Hollow outlasted everything. The towns that birthed it, the stars that forgot it, the voices that reshaped it. It lived not in barns, nor bells, nor books, but in the eternal circle of survival itself. Each time a storm came, each time patience carried lives through, the hollow burned anew, always steady, always unbroken, always alive. Dusty Hollow had long since slipped free of the tether of any fuel story. It no longer needed barns or ledgers or bells to be remembered. Those were garments worn for a time, then shed when the age had passed. What endured was the marrow beneath, the choice of patience over greed, of fairness over hunger, of trust over fear. That marrow could not be erased, because it was written not in words, but in the very structure of survival itself. Wherever life lived to endure, the hollow walked beside them. In a far-off age, where entire nations moved on colossal platforms rolling across endless plains, the hollow was known as the Axle Creed. Each wheel turned only because every spoke held its share of weight. They said the first keeper taught that balance kept wheels steady, while greed cracked them. Their children grew up placing hands on the spokes, whispering together or nodded out. They had never heard of the ledger, but each axle they honored was a line written in its pages. On a world drowned in darkness, where glowing rivers ran through caverns, the hollow was remembered, dead the river promise. People followed the water, trusting it to guide them through black stone. They carved ledgers into the cavern walls, marking debts in glowing minerals. The guardian, they said, was the one who remembered which river to follow, which turn led home. They never knew of Clara lantern-lit desk, but her spirit was alive each time they carved a mark into stone to keep balance true. Among people who soared in sky ships tethered to storms, Dusty Hollow was the chain. Each ship was linked to another, their survival bound together.
If one broke away, all risked ruin. They told stories of a shepherd who bound the lynx, carrying the weight of the chain through endless storms. They never saw Ezekiel calves in the snow, but they lived his strength every time they pulled another ship back from collapse. In desolate ruins, ways little remained but echoes, survivors carried the hollow in their voices. They they'd it the last song. They sang it at night to their children, words too simple to forget. Patience is bread, patience is roof, patience is fire. The song was not long, not ornate, but it was enough. And in that song, the hollow lived again, not add story, not add history, but the lullaby carved into the silence of the end.
Some thinkers of that endless horizon argued that Dusty Hollow was not yet a pattern of survival, but the very script by which existence was written. Stars, they said, kept their balance by the same creed. Planets held their orbits by the same fairness. Even time itself moved in patience, never rushing, never hollow, always steady. They claimed the ledger was older than creation, that every line written in it was mirrored in the order of the cosmos. Whether this was true or not, no one could deny the feeling the hollow was everywhere. And so the hollow endured, because endurance was all it had to been. It did not require belief to exist. It did not require memory to persist. It was not fragile like temples or towers, not fleeting like kings or gold. It was steady, silent, inevitable. Storms would come, greed would tempt, time would erode. But Dusty Hollow remained, not a place, not a myth, not even a story, but the truth. And in that truth, the lantern never went out. By then, Dusty Hollow had ceased to be a story passed mouth to ear, or even a ritual lived by hands. It had slipped beyond those forms into something more subtle, more profound. It was the rhythm of survival itself, the hidden chord beneath existence. Wherever life endured storms, the hollow was there. Wherever beings trusted one another when fear said betray, the hollow burned steady. Wherever patience carved a path through ruin, the ledger was written anew. On a shattered world where only fragments of land floated in sky, the hollow was called the binding wind. People tied bridges of cloth and rope between their drifting isles, knots made not for strength alone, but for faith. They said the keeper watched the winds, the guardian remembered the ties, and the shepherd carried those who slipped. They had no memory of barns or ledgers, but each knot they tied was a line of patience written into the air itself. In places of endless night, where light came only from the glow of fungi, the hollow lived to the glow pact. Families carried jars of living light and never let them fade, for every flame belonged to all. They whispered before bed, "The hollow glows in us," as though they knew nothing of Clara careful ink. Her patience was alive each time a child refilled a jar, so neighbors would sleep in dark. Among nomads who crossed oceans on rafts bound from trees, the hollow was remembered as the shared oar. They said every journey survived only when each hand rowed for all. To hoard strength was to doom the raft, but to share it was to see land again. They may not have spoken Ezekiel's name, but his spirit was there in every calloused palm that pulled at oar for another. Even among those who lived in vast towers of light beings made of thought itself, the hollow thrived. They did the first pattern, the balance that kept their collective whole. When one grew selfish, the pattern weakened. When all gave in rhythm, it burned brighter. They didn't know Dusty Hollow had place or time, but they kept its marrow alive in their own endless hum. And in lands of ruin, its silence pressed in hunger-thin voices, Dusty Hollow survived this whisper. Parents told children of a place where no one was left alone, where storms came but bonds endured, where patience outlasted everything else. The children kenned if such a place ever existed. The parents smiled through hunger and said, "It exists wherever you live it." And in that sentence, Dusty Hollow was reborn again. The skeptics of those distant ages no longer had ground to stand on. Too many worlds, too many forms, too many centuries had carried the hollow rhythm. It was no longer question, but certainty. The hollow was not one story nor one valley. It was the law of survival, the lantern flame behind creation storms. Some thinkers said it was older than stars, older than breath, older than even silence. That patience was the spine of being, and Dusty Hollow its first name. So the hollow endured, not in barns, nor bells, nor ledgers,
not even in story. Endured in the marrow of existence, ye constant hands tides, ye's patient hands stone, ye inevitable as dawn. Storms would always come, greed would always tempt, time would always erode, but patience would always endure. And that was the Hollow forever. Dusty Hollow had become so deeply woven into the fabric of being that it no longer needed to be spoken aloud to endure. It hummed beneath choices. It flickered in quiet moments. It breathed in the marrow of survival. Every time a hand gave without demand, every time a life endured without breaking, every time a community bound itself together against a storm, Dusty Hollow was alive, whether named or nameless, whether remembered or forgotten. In an age where people lived in colossal trees whose roots tangled across continents, the Hollow was called the Deep Binding. They said each root carried water from one tree to another, so none could starve alone. They carved symbols into the trunks, recording who had given and who had received. Their children learned early to cut the root was to cut yourself. They had never heard of a prairie or a ledger, but Harrod Creed was alive in every root that shared its strength, in lands of endless shifting sands, where tribes carried tents across dunes. The Hollow was remembered as the Evershade. At dawn, each tribe stretched their cloth to create shelter, overlapping their shade with neighbors. No wind cloth was large enough, but they built vast canopies where you could rest. They told stories of a guardian who rocked the shade, keeping balance fair. They knew nothing of Clara Lamplow Desk, yet they honored her every time they extended their shade to strangers. Among wanderers who floated in vessels through skies of thunder, Dusty Hollow was the bonded mast, each ship tied to another, their sails stitched together to hold steady. They spoke of a shepherd who bore the strain when the wind threatened to tear them apart. They had no name for Ezekiel, but they knew him every time one sailor braced another against the gale. In caverns deep below oceans, where light never reached, the Hollow was remembered in the breath chain. Families linked arms, passing air tanks hand to hand. Each knew they would breathe only if Ebb breathed. They told their children, the Hollow is in the breath you give, not the breath you keep. And though they never knew the ledger ink, they kept its law alive in every exhale. Even among beings who had shed bodies and lived the thought alone, the Hollow endured. They spoke of it in the core pattern, a rhythm beneath their shared existence. When greed disrupted it, collapse followed. When patience guided it, harmony held. They no longer remembered barns, bells, or prairie winds, yet their very being pulsed with Dusty Hollow law. And so across all ages, all shapes, all worlds, the Hollow never vanished. Sometimes it wore light, sometimes stone, sometimes silence, sometimes song. Sometimes it was a place, sometimes a practice, sometimes nothing more than a choice held in the heart. But always, always it endured. By then, no one asked if Dusty Hollow was real. They knew better. The question was not, did it happen? But can anything survive without it? And the answer was always the same: no. Life without patience collapses. Trust without fairness rots. Communities without sharing die. But with them, storms can be outlasted. And that truth was Dusty Hollow itself. So the Hollow remained that it always had, knit bound to dust, nor to prairie, nor to ink, but to the eternal marrow of endurance. It was the lantern flame behind every storm, the circle unbroken by time, the quiet law that holds creation steady. And in that truth, the Hollow was infinite. Dusty Hollow had ceased to be a tale that belonged to one people, or even to people at aught. It had become a current of existence, a steady undertow pulling every age back to the same truth. Storms pass, greed devours, time erodes, but patience endures. That rhythm was no longer story but law, no longer remembered but lived. Every culture, every generation, every shape of being stumbled into it as if rediscovering something eternal. And perhaps that was the Hollow's greatest secret. It was always new, and it was always old. Out of a world where skies shimmered with endless auroras, the Hollow was remembered to the lattice of light. Communities wove ribbons of color across their settlements, each thread glowing brighter when shared. They said the keeper arranged the ribbons, the guardian recorded their glow, the shepherd carried them across storms of ice. They had never known barns or prairie winds, but they honored the same essence in their lattice survival through fairness. Among desert traders who crossed endless dunes with caravans, the hollow was called the Well of Promise. They told of a hidden spring that never dried, so long as no one drank more than their share. They rocked their debts not in coin, but in beads. Each bead a sip given, a sip returned. Children played gade, counting beads and whispering, the hollow flows. They never knew Haran, crooked ledger, but his spirit was alive, and every fair drink passed from hand to hand. In starfaring ages, where beings lived among constellations, Dusty Hollow was sung as the lantern of the void. Pilots swore they saw it glowing on the horizon of deep space, a beacon where no greed was known, where fuel and warmth were always shared. Whether real or imagined, the story was enough, for in chasing it, they became it, keeping each other alive by fairness alone, even in the ruins of collapsed empires, where little remained but ash. The hollow was remembered as the ember. Survivors carried coals from fire to fire, refusing to let them die. They said the ember was older than kings, older than nations, older than stone itself. To let it burn out was to forget endurance. To pass it on was to promise survival. They knew no names, no barns, no ledgers, but they knew the marrow patience was fire that could never die if guarded together. Philosophers of those ageless times declared that Dusty Hollow was not a myth but an inevitability. Wherever storms rise, they wrote, the hollow appears. It is the axis of survival, the lantern at the heart of being. Its forms are countless, but its truth is one. And though scholars debated the shape of its first telling, they agreed. It had no end, because it had no beginning. It was circle, not line. It was law, not memory. So the hollow endured. It needed no relics, no monuments, no temples. It needed only storms, and storms never failed to come. It needed only choice, and choice never failed to be tested. Each time a hand shared in hunger, each time a debt was repaid fair, each time patience held when else crumbled, Dusty Hollow was alive again. And it would always be alive, as long as existence endured, not in dust, not in ink, not in barns or bells, but in the marrow of endurance itself. Dusty Hollow no longer belonged to memory, or even to myth. It belonged to the marrow of being, a pattern written into the way life held itself to death. It's not a town, not a story, not even a name anymore. It was the shape of endurance itself, rising in countless forms wherever storms pressed hard enough to demand it. Every age thought itself the first to discover it, and every age realized, in time, that it had only joined something older than stars. In one corner of creation, where entire communities lived upon floating fields carried by great beasts across oceans, the hollow was remembered as the bond of the herd. Each beast needed tending, each field needed care, and no family could survive alone. They rocked their debts in strands of woven grass, knots tied for labor given, loops undone for labor returned. They said the keeper tallied the knots, the guardian remembered the herds, and the shepherd bore the weight of storms that drove beasts astray. They never heard of Ezekiel or Clara, but their every knot kept the hollow alive. Far above clouded skies, among people who lived in towers suspended from vast balloons, the hollow was known as the weight. They taught their children that balance was survival, that if one balloon sank, all sank together. They painted ledgers on the silk of their balloons, recording what had been given, what had been received. The hollow floats, they said, only when I'll hold steady. And in those words, the prayer-I creed was reborn in air. In deserts where mirrors stretched to the horizon, reflecting sunlight so fierce it could blind, the hollow was spoken of. If these shadow gift, families built shelters of cloth that stretched wide enough for all, and they remembered that no shadow belonged to one alone. They told of a guardian who counted shade, of a keeper who measured it fairly, of a shepherd who spread it across the weakest. They had never seen Harrod Crooked Book, yet they carried his creed in every inch of cloth raised to shield their neighbors. Even in the cold silence between stars, the ships drifted through void with only thin walls between life and death. Dusty Hollow endured. They called it the Pact of Flame. Pilots passed candles from one to another, their light proof that heat and breath would be shared. They etched circles into the walls of their cabins, each circle a tally of patience kept. Break the flame, they whispered, and we will freeze. Keep the flame, and we endure. And in ruins, their children grew among shattered stones with no past to guide them. Dusty Hollow survived in instinct. They shared scraps if they had nothing else. They waited together because waiting alone meant death. They carved circles because part of them remembered balance even if their tongues did not. And though they never heard of barns or bells, they lived the hollow truer than any who had, for survival itself had become the creed.
Philosophers of those late ages finally surrendered the question of origin. Dusty Hollow, they wrote, not a story that began once and spread. It is a truth that rises wherever storms test life. It is the name we gave to patience when first we made it. But it was always there, and it did always be Eve. Some called it the first law, others called it the lantern principle, but most simply thought it survival. And so Dusty Hollow stretched further than memory, wider than myth, deeper than time. It burned behind every storm, whispered through every act of fairness, shone in every lantern passed hand to hand. It had no beginning anymore, no men birth, no fragile origin. It was the circle itself, unbroken, eternal, steady-eyed breath. Dusty Hollow had become more than legend. It had become the quiet pulse hidden under every world heartbeat. It no longer needed a storyteller by a fire, nor a ledger on a crooked desk, nor even names to carry it. It lived in the marrow of existence itself, showing its face in every corner where life chose trust over greed, endurance over collapse. Ages turned, stars burned out, civilizations crumbled and rose again, yet the hollow remained, silent, steady, unseen and unbroken. On a world veiled by eternal fog, where people navigated with ropes tied from home to home, the hollow was remembered at the knot line. They just said each rope was more than thread, it was promise.
To untie one was betrayal. To hold fast was salvation. They whispered of a keeper who measured every knot, a guardian who remembered every tie, and a shepherd who carried those who lost their grip.
They had no ink to write a ledger, but every knot they tied was a line of the hollow. Among those who lived in endless rivers, their houses floating on waters without shore, the hollow was thought the current trust. They rocked debts in driftwood carvings, each one cast into the river and carried to its keeper. Children grew up knowing that if they hoarded, the water would swallow them, but if they shared, the river would carry them to safety. They knew no barns or prairie bells, but the essence was there. Survival was trust carried forward. In mountains that pierced the sky, where storms raged so fierce that entire villages lived in caves, Dusty Hollow endured the fire circle. Every family brought wood and placed it at the center hearth so no one froze. The guardian role was taken by the elder who kept the fire, the keeper by the one who rocked whose wood had been given, the shepherd by those who carried logs through blizzards. They told their children the hollow burns there, and though they had never heard of Clara or Ezekiel, their fire was the same flame once lit in the valley first lantern.
Even among peoples who no longer spoke words but pulsed meaning through light and gesture, the hollow endured. They shimmered in triads. One pulse for planning, one for memory, one for compassion. They did not name them keeper, guardian, shepherd, yet the pattern was the same. It needed no names, for the rhythm itself was enough. Wherever beings endured together, the hollow lived. And in lands where ruins stretched farther than the eye could see, with silence pressed on the bones of fallen empires, Dusty Hollow was remembered at the circle stone. Survivors dead around it, carving marks for every life saved, every debt honored, every storm endured. They said the stone itself carried the ledger, its surface filling with patience instead of dust. They never spoke of Harrod ink, yet their carvings were his lines written anew. By then, no one doubted the hollow. The question was not if it had existed, but how many times it had been born. Philosophers argued that every world, every age, every people rediscovered it not because it was passed along, but because it was inevitable. Storms demanded it. Life required it.
The hollow was not invention, it was revelation, the moment when patience outlasted fear. Some called it the first law, others the eternal balance, but all agreed Dusty Hollow was not bound to time. It was time-proof of survival. So the hollow endured, never ending, never fading, never breaking. Was the lantern behind all storms, the circle beneath all stories, the steady truth that nothing, not greed, not ruin, not time itself, could erase. Dusty Hollow was no longer spoken if it had once been. It was spoken if it had always been, a natural and unquestioned at sunrise or time. No matter the form it took, song, ritual, law, silence, it carried the same marrow, patience, fairness, endurance. It had become the quiet law beneath creation, shaping itself again and again in the lives of those who chose to share instead of hoard, to wait instead of rush, to endure instead of rage. On a world where rain never ceased and the ground lay drowned in flood, the hollow was remembered as the lantern ark. Families built rafts lashed together, each carrying lamps glowing against the endless storm. They said the lamps stayed lit only so long as fuel was shared, and if one extinguished, darkness spread across all. They never knew of prairie barns or Clara Careful ink, but their lanterns burned with the same creed. Survival is trust made flame. Among people who wandered valleys of crystal where the ground sang beneath their feet, the hollow was remembered as a resonance. They taught that life endured only when voices sang together, harmonizing into balance. Their ledgers were notes carved into crystal walls, each tone proof of debts kept fair. They whispered of 3 tones, planning, memory, compassion, and though the names were lost, the keeper, the guardian, and the shepherd still sang through their chords. In sky cities tethered to mountains by cables, Dusty Hollow was the anchor. They painted marks on their chains, each one representing a life carried by Ab. The hollow holds, they said, only when none are left behind. They never spoke of Ezekiel or Harrod, yet each hand that checked the chains honored them. Far in the silence of starless space, among travelers who drifted in cold darkness, the hollow endured deemed the circle of heat. They vetted down furnaces, marking fuel in shared tallies. They knew that greed meant freezing, that patience meant survival. No barns, no bells, no prairie winds. But the hollow lived in every flame they fed tethered. Even in ruins Wade tongues had forgotten all but fragments. Dusty Hollow was alive in instinct. Survivors gave before they took. They waited when it was hard. They carried one another. They carved shapes into walls, 3 figures holding hands beneath a circle. They didn't know their names, but the archetypes remained, and with each carving, the hollow drew itself back from silence, breathing steady. Philosophers of those late age no longer asked whether Dusty Hollow was fact or myth. They called it the axis of survival, the code that turned beneath all time. They said storms were inevitable, greed unavoidable, decay certain. But the hollow was proof that existence itself was built on endurance. The universe writes itself in patience, they taught, and the hollow is its script. So Dusty Hollow endured, it always had, not bound to valley or village, not bound to names or ledgers, but bound to the marrow of life. It was the lantern behind all storms, the flame no darkness could smother, the circle no time could break, and in that truth it became infinite. Dusty Hollow no longer needed to be named for it to live. It had become as natural in the turn of seasons, as unshaketh of the rising of dawn, as steady as the hush that follows thunder. It did not matter whether beings remembered barns or ledgers or the crooked desk where ink first dried. The hollow had dissolved into the marrow of existence, surfacing wherever life was pressed by storm and forced to choose. And always the choice that endured was patience. On a world with endless storms of ash blotted out the sun, Dusty Hollow was remembered as the glowstone. Villages carved circles of luminous rock into their floors, placing one in every home. They said the stones burned brighter when patience held, dimmer when greed spread. Children grew up tracing circles into the ash, whispering the creed. Close, steady, share, and storm. They had never heard of Clara Belle Ledger, yet they wrote her lines with every glowing circle. Among those who lived in vast towers that climbed above poisoned air, the Hollow was sold the rung. They measured debts in the ladders they built, each rung carved with care, each rung shared by awe. We climb together, or we fall, they told their children. They never spoke the name Har-Run, graves, but his creed breathed in every careful rung placed to carry neighbors higher. In seas of glass that stretched forever, the heat cracked the ground into shards. The Hollow was remembered as a shudcloth. Families stitched vast sheets of fabric and stretched them across their camps, each stitch representing a life protected. To hoard cloth was to doom others, but to stitch together was to survive. They never knew Ezekiel toil in the snow, but they honored him with every thread, even among travelers of the void, where stars were too distant to warm them. The Hollow endured through the heat share. Ships lived in clusters, trading warmth, food, and time. Their ledgers were signals pulsed through the dark, lights blinking in rhythm, one for debts given, one for debts returned. Break the signal, they whispered, and the circle failed. They had no prairie, no barns, no bells, but their lights burned with the same patience that once lived in Dusty Hollow, and in ruins where nothing remained but silence. The Hollow survived in instinct. Survivors carved circles into dust, sang lullabies of patience, carried one another because alone meant ruin. They did not know why they did these things. They only knew they must. The Hollow did not need remembering. It needed living, and living was enough. Philosophers of that age declared that Dusty Hollow was not history at all, nor even myth. It was inevitability. Storms come, they wrote, and the Hollow rises. Greed tempts, and the Hollow resists. Time erodes, and the Hollow remains. It is not a place, it is the axis of survival itself. So Dusty Hollow endured, and not a memory of barns and bells, but there's a law of existence. It was the lantern that burned behind every storm, the circle no ruin did rake, the truth that nothing, not hunger, not greed, not time, could erase. And in that truth, the Hollow was infinite. Dusty Hollow had passed far beyond the reach of history, outlasted the need for proof or relics, and stepped into the place where truths live even when no one names them. It had become like gravity, invisible but inescapable, felt in every act of endurance across every age. No matter what forms it wore, no matter what names it carried, its marrow remained the same. Wherever storms pressed, the Hollow rose. Wherever greed tempted, the Hollow held. Wherever time eroded, the Hollow endured. On a world of endless cliffs where people carved homes into sheer stone, the Hollow was known as the carved line. Each family etched their promise into the cliff walls. Grain given, stone carried, shelter shared. The ledgers stretched high above the valleys, glowing in the sunset. These lines keep us, they said. And though they never knew of Clara ink, every carved line was her handwriting reborn. Among nomads who followed herds across plains of fire, the Hollow lived the ember circle. At night they built fires in rings, each family bringing fuel. The fire that survived longest was the one Wed-O gave. They told stories of a keeper who watched the sparks, a guardian who remembered the flames, a shepherd who carried fire through storms. They did not know Har-Rod, crooked desk, yet they honored him with every ember passed hand to hand. Far across oceans, where islands drifted like leaves, Dusty Hollow was remembered as the tide bond. They tied rafts together, making floating cities that could withstand storms. Their ledgers were shells rocked with symbols, traded back and forth. No one floats alone, they told their children. They had no barns, no bells, no prairie winds, but the ledger was alive in every tide raft. Even in the far void, where travelers wandered between dead stars, the Hollow burned to the last flame. They carried small lights in jars, each one lit from another, never letting the chain break. They said the flame itself was survival. To hoard it was death, to share it was life. They did not know Ezekiel's name, but they carried his strength every time they bore fire for another. And in ruins where silence swallowed all else, the Hollow endured it whispered. Families told their children of a place where storms came but trust endured, where greed knocked but was denied, where patience outlasted all. It is real wherever you live, they said. And in those words, Dusty Hollow was reborn, not memory but the present truth. By then, thinkers no longer called it myth. They vetted the spite of being. They argued that everything stars, rivers, lives was governed by the same rhythm. To burn too fast was to collapse. To hoard was to ruin. To endure patiently was to outlast. The hollow was not invention, it was revelation. It was the lantern light behind creation itself. And so Dusty Hollow lived on, not in barns, not in bells, not in ledgers, not even in names. It lived in the marrow of survival, in the eternal circle no storm could break. It was the flame behind all fires, the rhythm behind all songs, the balance behind all life. And in that balance, the hollow was infinite. Dusty Hollow had grown so deeply into the roots of existence that it no longer mattered who first spoke its name or lit its flame. Its truth was no longer something carried by memory. It was carried by the very act of living. Every age, every world, every people stumbled into it because it was already there, waiting, like stone under dust. It did not begin, and it could not end. Was the circle itself, and the circle always turned. On a world blanketed by endless winter, where the sun had long since dimmed, the hollow lived in the hearth oath. Villages dug deep into ice and built halls with shared fires. Each family rocked their wood with carvings before throwing it into the flames, proof that none gave less than they could, none took more than they needed. The hollow burns, they said, because we burned together. They knew nothing of prairie winds, yet the essence of Dusty Hollow glowed in every spark. Among people who rode great beasts across deserts of salt, the hollow was called the burden bond. Riders shifted loads from the weary to the strong, trusting that fairness would return in time. They tied knots and cords to mark burdens carried, untying them when balance was restored. Children learned to count not by numbers, but by knots. They had never seen Harrod ink or Clara steady script, but their knots were lines of the ledger written across sand. In lands where storms of glass rained from the sky, Dusty Hollow was the shelter law. Families built domes together, each block shaped and placed by many hands. They told stories of the keeper who measured the stones, the guardian who remembered their order, and the shepherd who braved storms to carry blocks for all. They knew nothing of Ezekiel calves in the snow, but they honored him with every wall raised to keep another safe. Even in the silence of deep space, where no ground remained beneath drifting vessels, the hollow endured in the light chain. Pilots lit beacons at their sterns, guiding others through the dark. To break the chain of light was to doom all behind. To hold it steady was to ensure survival. They whispered, "The hollow is the light you pass, not the light you keep." No barns, no bells, no schoolhouse ledgers, yet the lantern burned as bright as day. And in ruins where nothing but dust and bone remained, Dusty Hollow survived in gesture. Survivors shared food without counting, carried burdens without marking, waited together without question. They had forgotten the name, forgotten the story, forgotten the roles, but they lived it, and living was enough. The hollow did not need to be remembered to endure. It only needed to be lived. Philosophers of that age wrote with certainty. Dusty Hollow was not myth, nor parable, nor invention. It was inevitability. They said the universe itself was a ledger, its stars written line by line, its storms trials of balance, its patience the marrow that kept it whole. They claimed the hollow was not born in dust, but had always been there, long before ink, long before barns, long before speech. It was the flame behind creation fire, the rhythm behind time turning, the circle behind all circles. And so Dusty Hollow remained, not in relics, not in ruins, not in words. Ye live in the marrow of endurance, the lantern behind on storms, the flame no wind but smother, the truth that could not die.